Hey guys, tonight we begin with a journey that few would survive. Before we set sail, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so that others, maybe even your family members, can discover these forgotten histories too. And as always, drop your location and the time you're watching down in the comments. It's always haunting to see where and when you're tuning in from, scattered like little lanterns across the world. Because tonight, we return to an ocean that promised fortune, but in truth only called men to their doom. It always began with the promise of silver coin and glory. The 19th century was an age where the world was shrinking under the weight of sails and steam. And yet, to the men who crowded the docks of New Bedford or Nantucket, the sea still looked endless, like an untamed god waiting to be broken. Whales were oil, whales were profit, whales were the promise of a life better than the gutter filth of the industrial city. And so, young men, some no older than 16, pressed their names into contracts they barely understood, binding themselves to voyages that would strip the flesh from their bones long before they returned home, if they returned at all. The ocean did not call them with beauty, it called them with hunger. Hunger for oil, hunger for ivory teeth, hunger for baleen that could be bent into corsets and umbrellas for ladies who would never know the name of the boy whose hands had bled to deliver it. Whaling was not about exploration, it was extraction, and it demanded lives in payment. On the docks, the recruiters painted pictures of fortune. 4 years at sea, maybe 5. But when you came home, you'd have enough in your pocket to buy land, marry, and live like a man who mattered. They never told you the truth, that most returned with less than they had left with, beaten down by hunger, sickness, and lash. Their share of the profits swallowed by captains and owners who saw them as expendable cargo. They never told you that the ocean had its own way of keeping men, dragging them into depths where no light could follow. Those who signed on were not dreamers. They were the desperate. Farm boys from New England whose soil had gone barren, drifters from the cities, running from debt, from the law, from shame. Immigrants who spoke little English but knew the meaning of hunger. Black men promised freedom from slavery in exchange for labor at sea, though the decks they walked were little kinder. Even Pacific Islanders were pulled into the trade, tricked or coerced onto ships that would never see their homes again. Each man carried a story of escape, but the ship was no salvation. It was a trap. When the anchor was raised and the harbor fell behind, the smell of the shore, the sweet rot of fish markets, the smoke of chimneys, was replaced by the endless breath of the Atlantic. Waves slapped the hull like the heartbeat of a thing alive, and already the ocean tested them. Seasickness broke many within days. Grown men, strong on land, vomited themselves into weakness, mocked by the crew, cursed by the mates, until they either steadied or wasted away. The ocean allowed no weakness. Those who faltered became liabilities, and liabilities were given no sympathy. But the true terror of the sea lay not in storms or in monsters hidden beneath the waves. It lay in its scale. Imagine a horizon that never ends, water stretching so far that the mind buckles under it. Days without sight of land, weeks, months. The human spirit was not made for such expanse. Men who thought themselves bold felt small, and that smallness ate at them like a disease. You were not the master of the ocean, you were a guest, and an unwelcome one. Whales were the lure, but they were also the curse. To chase them meant to row out into swells that could flip a boat like a toy. To harpoon one meant inviting rage from a beast as long as the ship itself, whose tail could smash bones with a single strike. To kill one was to drag tons of flesh back to the ship, to cut it apart with knives that slipped on blubber, spilling blood so thick the deck ran slick with crimson rivers. The sea smelled of death, and death attracted sharks. Sometimes the sharks struck at the whales, sometimes they struck at the men. The ocean did not care, it demanded flesh, whether whale or human. And yet men signed on, again and again. Why? Because the land was no kinder. A whaling voyage was not chosen in hope. It was chosen in desperation. To stay was to starve. To go was to gamble. The ship became a floating coffin, and each man was both prisoner and pallbearer, rowing toward his own grave without knowing when he'd reach it. There was no romance to these voyages. Forget the myths of adventure, of brave sailors and harpoons glinting in sunlight. The reality was monotony and misery, broken only by terror. Weeks passed without sighting a whale, the crew driven half mad with boredom. Ropework cut grooves into palms. Saltwater rotted skin, vermin crawled through hammocks, and the food, barrels of salted pork, mouldy biscuits, stagnant water, made the stomach rebel. Men prayed for storms. For storms at least broke the monotony, even if they broke bones along with it. The ocean had its way of unmaking men. The healthy grew gaunt, their cheeks hollowing, their teeth loosening from scurvy. The strong grew weary, their backs bent from hauling rope and lifting barrels until their muscles tore. Even the devout grew blasphemous, cursed into madness by endless horizons and silence that mocked their prayers. The sea eroded men as surely as it eroded wood, and when a body slipped overboard, there was rarely an attempt to save it. Rope and boat were too precious to waste. The ocean would keep what it claimed. What makes the cruelty worse is that the ocean lured men not only with false promises, but with beauty. At dawn, when the sun bled over the horizon, the water turned gold, and it seemed as if heaven itself was spread across the waves. At night, the stars came so thick that they burned like fire, reflected in the Black Sea until it felt like you sailed through the sky. Dolphins leapt in silver arcs, and whales spouted mist that caught the light like jewels. It was breathtaking, yes, but the beauty was a trap. For every man who gazed in wonder, another slipped into despair, realizing that he would never touch land again, that his bones would rot beneath the same water that sparkled so sweetly above. The ocean gave beauty only to disguise its appetite. Every voyage began with songs, laughter, the chatter of men, comparing hometowns and boasting of fortunes to come. But by the second month, the songs faltered. By the fourth, laughter was rare. By the sixth, silence ruled. Whaling ships were not built for comfort. They were built for labor. Men slept shoulder to shoulder in fetid air, hammocks damp with sweat, lice crawling in the seams. Privacy did not exist. Dignity did not exist. The ocean stripped away everything human until only labor remained. And through it all, there was the knowledge that even survival did not guarantee reward. A man might endure storms, sickness, hunger, and years of toil, only to return to port and find his share of the voyage's profit barely enough to buy a new pair of boots. Men were expendable. The ocean was infinite. Whales would always be hunted. Ships would always be crewed. And no one on land cared how many bodies rotted in the deep to keep their lamps burning with oil. That was the doom of the ocean in the 19th century. Not that it killed swiftly, but that it killed slowly. A storm might take one man, a whale another, disease a third. But the rest were drained, day by day, until they returned home shadows of themselves, if they returned at all. The sea did not rage and roar every hour. More often, it simply waited. It waited for the ship to rot, for the spirit to crack, for the man to slip. And sooner or later, the ocean always won. To stand on the dock in the 19th century, staring out at that endless water, was to feel the pull of something vast and merciless. Men thought they were chasing whales. In truth, they were walking into the open jaws of the sea itself. And once the sea had you, it did not let go. The ocean was patient, but the contract was not. Before the salt air ever stung your face, before the deckboards bit your feet, before the horizon swallowed your name, there came the ritual at the docks, the moment where men, still dry, still free, placed their future into the captain's ink-stained hands. It was never a grand affair. No banners, no speeches, no promises written in gold. Just a cramped office or a tavern corner, the stink of stale beer in the wood, and the hunched silhouette of a shipping agent with a ledger thicker than any Bible. The men came in lines, hats pulled low, boots worn thin, eyes darting with a mixture of hope and dread. For most, there was no choice at all. Hunger drove them here, and hunger does not negotiate. The paper looked harmless enough. A page marked with neat columns of names, ages, home ports, wages. But each signature was less an agreement than a surrender. Once you scratched your mark, some with trembling letters, others with only the clumsy cross of the illiterate, you were no longer a man of land. You were cargo, claimed as firmly as the barrels of salt pork and the harpoons stacked on deck. The law saw you not as a worker, but as property of the voyage. To desert was theft, and theft was punished with irons, with lashes, sometimes even with the hangman's rope. What lured men to such bondage? The lies whispered by recruiters. A fortune in oil, they said, a share of the profits fit for a king. But the fine print told a crueler truth. Wages in whaling were not wages at all. They were shares. Fractions carved from a pie whose size no man could predict. A full share belonged to the captain, a half share to the first mate, smaller and smaller slivers to those below, until the ordinary sailor received little more than crumbs. 4 years of labour, and the prize at the end might not even pay the rent of a single month back on land. Many men finished a voyage owing more than they earned. Debts charged for clothing, tobacco, or a single replacement knife. The voyage could own you long after the ocean had released you. The docks themselves reeked of desperation. New Bedford, Nantucket, Sag Harbor, they were places where the air was thick with tar, hemp, and the rot of old fish. Ships lined the piers like teeth in a crooked jaw, their masts stabbing the sky, rigging humming in the wind. Here stood the vessels bound for years of hunting in seas no map could tame. Some were already heavy with the stench of old oil, their timbers blackened with smoke from tryworks fires, their decks scarred from knives and blood. Men looked at these hulks and saw both prison and hope. The same planks that had carried others to madness would now carry them. It was not only white New Englanders who signed their names. The docks were Babel, Portuguese, Cape Verdeans, Irish, runaway slaves, Pacific Islanders, all swept into the trade by hunger or by force. Some had been lured by promises made in foreign ports, only to find themselves trapped in a system that valued their bodies but not their voices. The whaling industry was ruthless in its inclusivity. It did not care what tongue you spoke or what god you prayed to, so long as your arms could haul rope and your back could endure. The recruiters knew how to read men. They knew the look of an empty stomach, the twitch of a hand too long without wages. They pressed the ledger forward with a smile that never reached their eyes. Plenty of work at sea, better than starving here. And the men, knowing the truth in those words, pressed their names down, binding themselves to years of hardship because the alternative was no less cruel. The sea did not have to seduce them. Poverty already had. Once the ink dried, the transformation began. The man who had stepped into the office left it as something else. He was no longer a laborer free to choose his work. He was a sailor bound to a ship, to a captain, to a voyage whose length could stretch beyond the horizon of years. He belonged to the ocean, whether he knew it yet or not. What made the contract most sinister was its vagueness. Nowhere did it promise return. Nowhere did it guarantee safety. It merely tied a man to profit, and profit was measured in oil, not lives. If the ship went down, so did the names in the ledger, erased as neatly as they had been written. Families left behind could petition, could weep, could rage, but they would receive no justice. The voyage owed nothing to the dead. Standing on the docks after the signing, a sailor often felt a strange mix of pride and dread. Pride, because he now belonged to something vast and dangerous, a calling greater than the cobbled alleys he had left behind. Dread, because the chains of that calling were invisible, and invisible chains are the hardest to break. Around him, the ship loomed, its sails furled like folded wings, waiting to unfurl and carry him beyond sight of land. The ship owners and agents, for their part, watched with satisfaction. For every man who staggered back at the voyage's end, broken and hollow-eyed, 10 more stood ready at the dock, pen in hand, desperate to trade one misery for another. Whaling was not sustained by courage. It was sustained by hunger, and hunger never ceased. The men rarely understood how final their choice was. They believed, in the arrogance of youth, that they could endure anything. A few lashes, a few storms, surely worth it for a fortune at the end. They did not yet know the taste of rot in their biscuits, the agony of a tooth loosening from scurvy, the terror of a whale's fluke smashing a boat to splinters. They did not yet know the boredom so thick it made men hallucinate voices in the wind, or the rage that simmered when captains withheld rations as punishment. They signed because they could not imagine the depth of suffering that awaited them. Even those who hesitated were often tricked or trapped. Some recruiters offered advances, coins pressed into eager palms, debts created before the ink was dry. To walk away was to be a thief. Others were plied with drink, signatures scrawled in taverns by men too drunk to read. By dawn, they belonged to a ship they barely remembered agreeing to join. The dockside ritual was quick, but its weight was eternal. Once bound, a sailor could not easily unbind himself. Desertion was hunted with dogs, with shackles, with iron. The harbour police served not the men, but the ship owners, returning runaway sailors to their captains like escaped livestock. The ocean did not tolerate disobedience. It claimed men not only with waves and storms, but with laws and ledgers. And so, with signatures sealed, the men waited for the tide. They stood on planks slick with brine, listening to gulls scream overhead, watching the ship creak as cargo was loaded. Barrels, rope, harpoons, the tools of a bloody trade. Some smoked to calm their nerves, others spat into the sea as if to mark their defiance. But all knew that the ground beneath their feet was slipping away. The land would not hold them long. The truth was this: a whaling voyage killed many before it even began. For when a man signed that paper, he surrendered not only his freedom, but his chance at a life untouched by the sea. Even those who survived the voyage returned changed, scarred, broken, emptied, and many did not return at all. The docks that promised salvation were the gates to a slow execution, and the pen was the blade. The ocean called, yes, but the first step toward its doom was not taken on a ship, nor in a storm, nor in the shadow of a whale. It was taken at a desk, in the dim light of a dockside office, when a desperate hand reached for the pen and a name was signed away to salt, to blood, and to silence. Once the ink had dried and the tide was right, there was no turning back. The moment your foot touched the deck, you learned that the ship was not a vessel of adventure. It was a cage built of oak and iron, with walls that groaned and leaked and shifted beneath your weight. The open sea was freedom only to those who gazed at it from the shore. For the sailor, it was confinement of the cruelest kind. At first glance, the whaling ship might have seemed grand, masts rising like cathedral spires, sails furled tight, rigging stretched in a web that promised movement toward distant horizons. But step below deck, and the illusion dissolved. The quarters were carved into the belly of the ship with no thought for comfort. A low ceiling pressed down on you, beams waiting to split your scalp if you stood too fast. Hammocks swung in rows, strung so close you could feel the heat of the man beside you, smell the sourness of his breath, hear the grind of his teeth at night. The air itself felt alive, thick with sweat, tar, and mildew, never fully rid of the smoke from the tryworks fire that lingered in the timbers like a memory of death. Privacy was a concept left on land. Here, there was only exposure. Your belongings, if you had any, fit into a sea chest no larger than a stool. Your body was always watched, by the mates, by your fellow crew, even by the rats that scurried in the corners, their eyes glinting like sparks in the dark. You ate with the same men you slept beside, worked with them, bled with them, quarreled with them, and sometimes killed with them. The ship made strangers into brothers, but it also made brothers into enemies. There was no escape from either. Every inch of the ship belonged to discipline. The captain's cabin stood like a throne room at the stern, modest in size, but rich compared to the rest, its walls lined with charts and instruments. His word carried weight heavier than any anchor. A man could be flogged for insolence, for idleness, for nothing more than the suspicion of disobedience. The mates enforced his will with rope's end and clenched fists, and the crew endured it because the ocean offered no alternative. To resist was to invite punishment. To rebel was to invite death. The ship did not bend to men, men bent to the ship. Above deck, the world was larger but no freer. The planks pitched underfoot with every swell, coated in brine that stung your skin raw. Lines had to be hauled, sails unfurled, barrels shifted, labor that never ended, day or night. The call of all hands could drag you from sleep into storm, into darkness, into waters that boiled with the wrath of winter. The ship demanded your body, and it took it piece by piece. Flesh cut open by rope burns, nails split on frozen decks, joints swollen from hauling weight that would crush an ox. Even your ears became prisoners, battered by the ceaseless groan of timbers and the wind howling through rigging, until silence itself became an alien sound. The whaling ship was worse than a prison because it pretended to be something else. A prison has walls you can see, guards you can name. A ship disguised its chains in duty, in labor, in the promise that all this suffering had purpose. But when you peered across the endless water, when the days bled into weeks and the weeks into months, purpose began to rot. The hunt for whales was not constant. Most days were swallowed by waiting. Endless waiting, with nothing to do but swab the deck, mend the sails, grease the pulleys, and dream of land that shrank further from memory with every sunrise. Hunger gnawed at you before the voyage was long underway. The rations were simple: salted meat that stank of brine, hardtack biscuits so infested with weevils that sailors joked the insects added protein, water stored in casks turned foul, crawling with slime that coated your tongue. There were no fresh vegetables, no fruit, no dairy. Weeks at sea stripped your body of its strength. Gums bleeding from scurvy, skin yellowing, wounds refusing to heal. The ship itself became a slow executioner, feeding you just enough to keep you working, never enough to keep you well. Disease thrived in the dark belly of the vessel. A cough in one hammock spread through a dozen before the week was out. Dysentery turned the cramped quarters into a stinking nightmare, men groaning and fevered with no place to retreat. The doctor, if there was one, had little more than laudanum and sores. Bloodletting, purges, amputations, these were the cures. And more often than not, the cure killed quicker than the disease. The dead were sewn into canvas, weighted with stone, and slid into the ocean with barely a pause. Their absence was noted, their rations divided, their memory already fading as the next wave crashed. And still the ship demanded labor. Even the sick were forced to haul ropes until they collapsed. Even the dying were expected to man the boats if a whale was sighted. Weakness was a crime, punished not with sympathy, but with contempt. Men cursed their shipmates for faltering, for endangering the crew with their illness, for being dead weight in a place where survival depended on strength. Compassion was a luxury none could afford. The whaling ship bred violence as naturally as it bred vermin. Tensions simmered in the endless monotony, exploding in fights over rations, over stolen tobacco, over insults whispered in the dark. Knives flashed, fists cracked bone, blood spattered the planks, and the mates restored order with lashes, their whips biting until flesh peeled. Some men grew silent under the lash, their spirits broken. Others grew more savage, their humanity stripped until they seemed closer to beasts than to sailors. The prison of the ship did not merely hold men, it transformed them. Even the very structure of the vessel betrayed its cruelty. The try-works, massive iron cauldrons used to boil whale blubber into oil, loomed like a gallows on deck. When they burned, the air filled with acrid smoke that choked lungs and blackened skin. The stench of rotting flesh clung to your hair, your clothes, your very pores, until even the wind could not wash it away. You carried the smell of death as surely as you carried chains. The ship offered no escape, not even in dreams. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the roll of the waves, by the call of duty, by the nightmares of drowning. Men dreamed of home only to wake to darkness, wood, and the breathing of a dozen others pressed too close. Time ceased to move as it did on land. Days blurred, marked only by the ringing of the ship's bell, the sun's climb and fall, the endless repetition of labor. The prison was not just physical, it was temporal. You were trapped in a cycle that devoured years without mercy. And yet, the cruelest aspect of this prison was its false promise of release. Unlike a dungeon, where a sentence might end, a whaling voyage had no fixed term. You sailed until the hold was full, until the oil was rendered, until the captain deemed the profit sufficient. That might be 3 years, it might be 5, it might never end at all, if storms shattered the ship, if whales eluded the harpoons, if hunger and disease thinned the crew to nothing. There was no calendar to count down, no certainty of return. Every sunrise was another reminder that the ship held you longer than you had thought possible. The land faded from memory, faces of family blurred, voices from home grew faint. The prison of the ship was so complete that even your thoughts betrayed you, circling endlessly around the same desires: food, rest, release. Men forgot what freedom felt like. Some no longer wanted it. The ship broke them so thoroughly that when they stumbled ashore years later, they walked as prisoners still, unable to find peace in silence, unable to sleep without the groan of timbers, unable to feel whole without the weight of rope in their hands. To step aboard a whaling ship was to step into a cage without bars, a sentence without end. It was not a journey, but a confinement, not an adventure, but a slow degradation. And the ocean, patient as ever, waited outside those wooden walls, knowing that when the prison finally broke you, it would be there to claim the rest. If the ship itself was a prison, then the place where men slept was its most suffocating cell. You learned quickly that hammocks were not a refuge, not a corner to claim as your own, but a swaying reminder that privacy no longer existed. They were strung in rows so tight you could reach out in the dark and brush the shoulder of the man beside you. The beams overhead pressed down like a lid. The air was damp with sweat and mildew, and the sound never ceased. Snoring, coughing, muttered curses, the shuffle of rats scurrying across ropes. The hammocks themselves stank of salt and grease, rarely washed, often damp, never truly clean. They cradled men not into comfort, but into exhaustion, rocking with the roll of the sea until sleep came in snatches, fitful and broken. And who were the men in those hammocks? Strangers at first, thieves often, runaways always. You shared your nights with men whose pasts were fogged with lies. Some boasted of homes they never had, of crimes they had not committed or perhaps had, their stories shifting with the tide. Others said nothing, faces hidden in the gloom, eyes watching, weighing. You could not choose your neighbors. You could only endure them. Theft was constant. A pipe left unwatched vanished. A scrap of tobacco tucked into a chest disappeared. Even blankets were stolen, cut in half while a man slept beneath them. No one trusted anyone, and yet everyone was forced into intimacy. Men slept with their few belongings bound to them by rope, knives hidden in their boots, coins, if they had any, stitched into the lining of their shirts. To close your eyes was to risk waking poorer than before, and often there was no waking at all. Men smothered in drunken brawls, knifed in silence, bodies hauled up and tossed overboard before dawn. The ship did not pause for murder. It merely noted the absence at roll call and shifted the hammocks to fill the space. The close quarters bred suspicion as surely as disease. A cough in the dark was met with curses, for no one trusted it to be harmless. A man scratching at his skin might be hiding lice that would soon infest everyone. A whisper of mutiny could spread like fire, and so whispers were punished as harshly as deeds. The hammocks became places of listening, of watching, of fear. Every movement, every sound was magnified in the silence of the night, until men heard betrayal even in the rustle of canvas. The air itself was an enemy, with no windows, only narrow gaps where the timbers met. The quarters were thick with breath, heavy with the stench of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, and the rot of wet clothing that never dried. Lanterns guttered in the gloom, casting long shadows that turned faces into masks. The lack of light gnawed at men as much as hunger did. Days spent under the blazing sun gave way to nights so dark that it felt like the ocean itself had swallowed you whole, leaving only the creak of the ship and the suffocating nearness of other men. There was no escape from the closeness. Fights erupted over inches of space, elbows jabbed, hammocks cut down in anger, men dragged from their rest and beaten bloody for a careless shove. And yet, the next night, they lay side by side again, bound by necessity, forced into a fraternity that stank of resentment. The ship was too small for grudges, but grudges festered anyway, poisoning the air more deeply than the smoke of the try-works. Worse than the thieves were the broken men, those who wept quietly in the dark, clutching at scraps of home. A letter, a lock of hair, a wooden charm. Their despair infected the hammocks around them. Sleep became impossible with the sound of stifled sobs, with the knowledge that another mind was unraveling beside your own. Madness crept silently in those quarters, feeding on the claustrophobia, on the hunger, on the endless confinement. A man could be your bunkmate one night and leap screaming into the sea the next, unable to endure another hour of the cage. And yet, even despair was stolen. There was no room to grieve in private, no space to cry without witnesses. Every weakness became gossip, every tear a reason for ridicule. Sailors learned to mask their fear with anger, their sorrow with violence. The hammocks became arenas where strength was measured not only in fists, but in the ability to keep one's spirit hidden. To falter was to invite humiliation, to be marked as prey. The hierarchy extended even here. Old hands claimed the best spots, closer to the thin trickle of air, further from the bilge where water pooled and rats nested. Greenhorns were shoved into the worst corners, where mildew dripped from beams and the stench of waste was strongest. To earn a better place meant years of suffering, obedience to the lash, survival against odds that killed most before they could rise. The hammocks reminded you, night after night, that you were nothing but replaceable flesh, ranked and measured by usefulness, not by humanity. Sometimes, when storms raged, the hammocks swung like pendulums. Men tossed from them into the planks below. Bones cracked, skulls split, but there was no sympathy. A man injured in the quarters was a man who could not work, and a man who could not work was soon a corpse. The hammocks offered no protection, only the illusion of rest. And always there was the noise. Snores like saws cutting through wood, coughs that shook the lungs raw, the endless creak of ropes and beams. Sleep, when it came, was shallow, fractured by the footsteps of mates stamping down the ladder, by the bell that called all hands, by the cries of men dragged from slumber into storm or whale chase. You never truly rested. You only drifted into exhaustion deep enough to forget for a while that you were still alive. It was in the hammocks that the truth of the voyage revealed itself most clearly. The ocean killed men slowly, but the ship killed them from within. It eroded dignity, trust, compassion. It turned strangers into threats, thieves into neighbors, enemies into bedfellows. It taught you that nothing belonged to you, not your space, not your food, not even your dreams. To live among hammocks strung shoulder to shoulder was to learn that survival was not only about storms and whales and captain's wrath. It was about enduring the slow suffocation of intimacy without choice, of sharing every breath with men who might rob you, betray you, or drag you into madness with them. The voyage did not need to kill you outright. It only needed to press you into those swinging canvases, night after night, until the weight of strangers crushed the last of your spirit. And when dawn came, when the bell rang, and the men dragged themselves from their hammocks into the pale light of morning. There was no relief. The ship awaited, the ocean awaited, and the thieves and strangers beside you awaited too. There was no end, no mercy, no escape. Only another night, another hammock, another reminder that in the world of whaling even sleep was a form of punishment. When the bell clanged for meals, it was not hunger that stirred men from their hammocks, so much as the stubborn instinct to survive. Hunger, after all, never left them. It gnawed constantly, a quiet parasite in the belly. But the food itself was another torment. To call it nourishment was generous. It was more often punishment served in wooden bowls. The ship's cook was not a chef, but a prisoner himself, chained not by iron, but by the endless monotony of his task. Armed with little more than a blackened pot, a greasy ladle, and salted provisions packed years earlier, he presided over the galley like a reluctant executioner. His fire sputtered in the iron stove, its smoke filling the cramped space and seeping through the seams of the ship, until the quarters reeked of burnt fat and rancid grease. What he served was less meal than endurance test. The staple was salt beef, hacked into slabs so hard they might as well have been carved from the hull itself. The men called it salt horse, for it had the colour and toughness of leather. Before it could even be chewed, it had to be soaked, boiled, sometimes hammered with the blunt side of an axe just to break it down. Even then, it resisted the teeth, crumbling into fibrous chunks that left the gums raw. It was meat only in name, salt and sinew pressed into the shape of food. Alongside it came biscuits, or hardtack, a sailor's curse baked into brick. Flour and water, nothing more, left to harden until it could last decades. They came alive with weevils, tiny worms wriggling from their holes, scattering across the table when a biscuit was broken. Men tapped them against the planks to shake out the vermin, but most of the time they crunched them down without a pause. The taste was not of bread, but of dust, chalk, and age. A biscuit might split a tooth before it satisfied hunger. What vegetables there were had long since rotted into mush, and fruit was a memory. Once in a great while, dried peas appeared, boiled into a paste that clung to the spoon like glue. More often the meal was nothing but salt meat, salt fish, and more salt. So much salt that tongues blistered, lips cracked, and thirst became unbearable. Water barrels, filled months before, offered no relief. The liquid within was warm, often slimy, sometimes alive with growth. A mouthful was taken more out of desperation than choice, followed quickly by gagging and the taste of rot. On rare occasions, when luck or cruelty allowed, the crew was fed pork instead of beef. This, too, was preserved by salt until it shone with crystals like frost. Fat slicked the hands, the lips, the very air. Boiled, fried, or eaten raw, it coated the stomach like tar. Men joked grimly that it was not pork, but coffin wood disguised as meat. The maggots that festered in the barrels were not picked out. They were part of the protein. They sank into the stew, curled white against the greasy broth, swallowed down without ceremony. Hunger made everything edible, and hunger was constant. The labor of whaling burned through calories faster than the body could replenish them. Hours at the oars, hauling ropes, boiling blubber under the relentless sun. Every task drained strength. Yet the meals offered little but fatigue disguised as food. Bellies swelled with salt and water, leaving men sluggish, while malnutrition hollowed their cheeks and loosened their teeth. Scurvy lurked in every mouth, gums turning spongy, breath foul, teeth loosening one by one until they fell out with the next bite of hardtack. The table was no refuge from misery. Men crowded shoulder to shoulder on benches slick with grease, their bowls shared with flies and rats alike. There was no courtesy in eating, only survival. Hands shoved, spoons clashed, curses flew. Food was not served in equal measure. The strongest often took the largest share. To protest was to invite fists, and sometimes knives. The weak learned to eat quickly or not at all. The cook himself was despised, though his crime was only proximity to the food. Every burnt stew, every worm-ridden biscuit, Every rancid cask of pork was laid at his feet. He was the scapegoat for a system that treated provisions as afterthoughts. Men hurled insults at him, sometimes their bowls. There were tales of cooks beaten half to death for serving spoiled meat, though no one could have served it fresh. It had spoiled before the voyage began. The smell of the galley clung to everything. Clothes, skin, hair, all carried the stink of boiling fat, of grease that never washed out. The try-works added their smoke to the mix, until the very pores of the sailors oozed with it. Men reeked like the carcasses they hunted, their own bodies little different from the meat in the barrels. Salted, preserved, decaying slowly. Even celebration was poisoned by scarcity. A successful hunt might mean fresh meat, the flesh of the whale itself carved and roasted. Yet even this turned bitter. The taste was oily, the texture strange. It filled the stomach but left the mouth coated, the throat burning. Men devoured it anyway, their faces slick with fat, knowing it was the best they would eat for months. When it was gone, they returned to the salt horse, the weevil bread, the endless stew of decay. And always, disease lurked in the food. Dysentery spread from spoiled meat. Fevers followed tainted water. Worms bred in the guts of those who swallowed too hastily. A man could eat himself into illness just as easily as into strength. There was no doctor to cure him, only the grim indifference of his shipmates, who moved his hammock aside when he grew too weak to rise. Hunger warped the mind as surely as it did the body. Men dreamed of feasts they would never taste again. Roasts, pies, fruit dripping with sweetness. They woke with saliva on their lips and bitterness in their hearts. Some grew violent, fighting over crumbs. Others grew quiet, hoarding scraps like animals. A few turned desperate enough to eat what was unthinkable: rats, leather, candle wax. In whispered tales, when ships were becalmed and provisions gone, the line was crossed further still. But those were stories men told in low voices, never too loudly, for fear the sea might be listening. Meals became less about food than about endurance. To sit at the table was to stare into the truth of the voyage. That survival was measured not in victories over whales, but in the ability to choke down poison day after day. The salt carved the body hollow, the maggots humiliated, the hunger punished. A man did not eat to live. He ate to postpone dying. And when the bowls were scraped clean, when the last biscuit was gnawed to crumbs, the men rose not satisfied, but resentful. Their bellies ached, their tongues swelled, their teeth loosened. They dragged themselves back to the deck, to the ropes, to the endless toil, already dreading the next bell, the next meal, the next reminder that in the world of whaling, even supper was a form of suffering. The taste of salt meat still lingered in the sailors' mouths when the sky itself began to change its mood. At sea, food was torment, but weather was tyranny. The ship was never secure. Not truly. It rode on shifting water, at the mercy of skies that turned cruel without warning. Men learned to fear not only the hunger in their bellies, but the violence above their heads. For a storm at sea was no passing inconvenience. It was an ordeal designed to break body and spirit alike. It began with silence, the kind that felt unnatural, like a held breath before a scream. The wind that had filled the sails vanished, the sea flattening into a deceptive calm. Birds disappeared. The air thickened with damp, heavy pressure that sat on the chest like a stone. Sailors looked upward, squinting at clouds that gathered low on the horizon, dark as bruises. A few muttered prayers under their breath. They knew what was coming. The first gusts arrived suddenly, like a drunkard's shove, rattling rigging and whipping loose lines across the deck. Then came the rain, sharp, needling sheets that blinded the eyes and soaked the very marrow of a man's bones. In minutes, the deck was a torrent. Water poured down the scuppers, sloshed ankle-deep across the planks. Voices were drowned out by the roar of wind. Orders had to be screamed into ears, fists pounding shoulders to be understood. The sails cracked like gunshots. Canvas ballooned, ropes groaned, and blocks screeched in protest. Men scrambled aloft, climbing ratlines slick with rain and spray, their hands raw from the hemp. One slip, one missed grip, and the sea would claim them. There was no ceremony for a man washed overboard. In the churn of a storm, he vanished before the crew could even shout his name. No lifelines, no rescue boats. The ship could not pause for a single life. Below deck, the hammocks swung like pendulums, crashing bodies against one another. Water forced its way through seams in the hull, dripping steadily, sometimes in streams. The stench of bilge rose, rank and suffocating, as barrels shifted and rats scrambled for safety. Sleep was impossible. Even lying still was a struggle. The body flung from one side of the hammock to the other, as if mocked by the sea itself. But it was on deck where the true battle raged. The helmsman fought the wheel with arms that trembled, muscles tearing under the strain. Every wave that struck the ship was a hammer blow, sending shudders through timbers, rattling teeth in jaws. Walls of water rose higher than the masts, breaking over the bow in thunderous crashes. Men were knocked flat, swept across the planks, clinging desperately to anything bolted down. More than one sailor broke ribs against the rail, wrists against belaying pins, legs against barrels rolling loose. The storm was not a single event, but a sustained assault. Hours stretched into days. Rain blurred into spray until the world was nothing but water and noise. The salt burned eyes raw, skinned lips to bleeding cracks. Hands blistered and split from ropes, nails tore away, voices gave out from shouting. Still the work never ceased. Sails had to be reefed, pumps worked to keep the ship from drowning, rigging secured again and again as the wind ripped it free. Exhaustion became another form of drowning. Men staggered like corpses, their movements sluggish, their eyelids heavy. A sailor might tie himself to the rigging not only to keep from being swept away, but to keep from collapsing outright. Sleep snatched in moments was broken by the crash of waves, the bark of orders, the sudden cry of "hold fast" as another mountain of water bore down. The sea did not just punish bodies, it broke minds. Hours of unrelenting fear hollowed men out. The sound of a mast bending, a spar snapping, was enough to send panic flooding the crew. They had seen ships break apart before, splintering under the weight of waves, swallowed whole within minutes. Survival was not guaranteed. It was a coin flip with the ocean, and the ocean always cheated. Superstitions thrived in such storms. Some swore they saw faces in the waves, sneering, laughing, the dead come back to mock the living. Others claimed to hear voices in the wind, curses from the deep. Men spat over the side, muttered charms, clutched talismans sewn into their shirts. A few went silent altogether, their eyes wide, convinced the storm was punishment for sins too great to name. When lightning came, it turned the ship into a stage of horrors. Jagged forks lit the rigging in ghastly flashes, every rope and sail glowing like bones in an X-ray. Thunder cracked so loud it seemed the heavens were splitting open. Bolts struck the water, sometimes the mast itself, sending shocks through the ship that left men gasping, their hair standing on end. The smell of ozone mixed with tar and sweat, an acrid perfume of chaos. And then there was the cold. Even in temperate seas, storms stripped warmth from the body. Clothes soaked through offered no protection. Fingers stiffened, lips turned blue, teeth chattered until jaws ached. Frostbite was not reserved for polar waters. Numb hands in a storm could mean the difference between gripping a line and falling into the abyss. The sea was always waiting, black and bottomless, ready to pull a man down and never return him. Sometimes the storm broke more than the men. It broke the ship. Masts cracked and fell with the sound of cannon fire, crushing whoever stood beneath. Sails shredded into ribbons, leaving the vessel crippled. Pumps failed, the hold filled with water, barrels floated loose. Fire was a terror in calm seas, but in storms it was the opposite, drowning. Men worked the pumps until their spines felt split in two, but still the water rose, and with it the despair. Days later, when the storm at last relented, what remained was not triumph but ruin. The men were scarcely recognizable as human. Their eyes were bloodshot, their skin wrinkled from constant soaking, their bodies bruised, cut and spent. Some limped from broken bones hastily set. Others coughed blood from lungs filled with spray. Silence replaced the roar, a silence so heavy it felt like the ship itself mourned. The sea offered no apology. The sun might return, the sky might clear, but the memory of the storm clung like a scar. Every creak of the timbers afterwards sounded like a warning. Every cloud on the horizon raised the hairs on the neck. Men walked differently, spoke differently. They had been bent by the storm, if not broken, and they carried that bend with them always. For those who think survival at sea was merely about whales or hunger, they forget the storms. Hunger gnawed slowly, but storms killed swiftly. They turned ships into coffins and men into offerings. And even when they did not claim lives outright, they claimed pieces, bones, strength, faith. A sailor might walk away from a storm, but he never left it behind. The storm had left the crew hollow-eyed and battered, but there was no pause to gather themselves. The sea, indifferent as ever, offered its next trial almost immediately. The lookout in the masthead called down with a voice half lost in the wind, a spout, a column of vapor, pale against the horizon, rising like a ghost from the deep. The signal every whaler waited for, dreaded, and depended on. It meant the hunt was at hand. Men who had not slept in days, whose hands still bled from hauling ropes in the storm, straightened as if whipped. Fatigue vanished into the adrenaline of duty. The boats had to be lowered, harpoons sharpened, lines coiled and stowed in readiness. The great prize had revealed itself, and there was no question of rest. A whale meant oil, and oil meant profit. No storm, no bone-deep weariness, no fear of death itself could interrupt that arithmetic. The lowering of the boats was chaos rehearsed into ritual. The long, narrow whaleboats were swung out from their davits and dropped into the heaving water, crew clambering down with the grace of desperation. Each boat held 6 men, 5 at the oars, and the boat steerer in the bow with harpoon in hand. The mate, crouched at the stern, clutched the steering oar that would decide their course. The mothership shrank behind them as the boats pulled away, fragile splinters of wood on the immensity of the ocean. Rowing was a punishment in itself. The oars were heavy, their handles slick with salt and sweat. The rhythm was set by curses barked from the stern. Pull, 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 until arms trembled, shoulders burned, lungs screamed for air. Each man was a cog in the great machine of the hunt, and the machine allowed no faltering. The whale surfaced again, exhaling with a sound like a bellows, the vapor hanging in the air before drifting into nothing. That sound, half sigh, half trumpet, was the voice of money, and the men pulled harder. The approach was long, brutal. The whale moved with deceptive slowness, its bulk gliding through water with a grace that mocked the straining men. For hours they rowed, closing the gap inch by inch, the sun climbing and then beginning to fall, their bodies aching in silence except for the rhythmic slap of oars against water. And when at last they came near enough, the silence broke into frenzy. The boat steerer rose, harpoon lifted. It was a crude instrument, more spike than spear, its head barbed to tear and hold, its shaft heavy as a club. The line, coiled at his feet, was the real danger. Hundreds of fathoms of rope, tarred and salted, ready to run out in a blur once the iron struck home. If it fouled around an ankle, a wrist, even a finger, it would snatch a man overboard and drag him into the depths before he could cry out. The sea had taken many this way, swallowing them not with waves, but with the very rope that bound them to the hunt. The strike came sudden. The harpooner flung the iron with both arms, a desperate thrust born of exhaustion and hunger. The barb sank deep into living flesh. The whale bellowed, the water around it exploding into foam. Its flukes rose high, then crashed down with the force of falling trees. The boat rocked, nearly capsized. Men screamed, ducking, scrambling to keep balance. The line shot out, whirring through the notch in the bow like a saw blade. Smoke rose from the friction. Buckets of water were poured to keep it from catching fire. This was the moment sailors called the Nantucket sleigh ride. The harpooned whale, in its panic, fled with astonishing speed, dragging the boat behind it as if it were a toy. The men clung to thwarts, oars dragging uselessly in the water, their stomachs lurching as the bow cut waves like a knife. The boat groaned, its timbers straining. Any flaw in its build would mean shattering, splintering, drowning. Some hunts ended quickly, the whale tiring after minutes, its strength bleeding away. Others stretched for hours, the creature pulling boat and men across miles of ocean, their arms locked around the gunwales, their bodies battered by spray and sun and fear. Each spout that rose, each arc of its back, brought the final confrontation closer. When the whale slowed, the order came. Haul line, close in, lance it. The boat crept near, the harpoon tethering man to beast. The mate took the long lance, a slimmer, deadlier weapon, its purpose not to hold, but to kill. He stood, braced against the rocking, and drove it into the whale's side again and again, seeking the lungs, the life. The water turned red, the sea itself shuddering with the beast's agony. It rolled, thrashed, dove, rose again, its massive body striking the boat with blows that could snap a man's spine. Death was not instant. Whales sometimes fought for hours, refusing to yield, each spout a geyser of blood. Men watched in silence, knowing the outcome was certain but unwilling to celebrate. There was no glory in this, only necessity. And when at last the creature rolled onto its side, the fluke beating weakly, the ocean around it slick with gore, a kind of silence fell. A silence that carried both triumph and dread. For the sailors, survival of the hunt was no guarantee of safety. Now came the labor of towing the corpse back to the ship, lashing it alongside and beginning the grim work of flensing. Men climbed onto the floating mountain of flesh, knives in hand, slicing great strips of blubber that were hoisted aboard. The stench was indescribable. Oil, blood, decay, all mixing in the sun's heat. The sea turned crimson, gulls and sharks gathering in frenzy. Slipping on the carcass meant plunging into that maelstrom, and many never returned. The cutting in was followed by the trying out, boiling the blubber in great iron pots, the smoke reeking, greasy, suffocating. Clothes soaked in oil, hair stiff with fat, skin slick with the stench that clung for weeks. Fires burned on deck, sparks flying in the wind, the ship itself at risk of going up in flames. Men worked through day and night, the only reward the promise of more work. The carcass rotted even as they labored, the smell burrowing into nostrils and memory alike. But beyond the labor, beyond the smell and the risk of fire, there was the shadow of the harpoon itself. For every whale killed, there was the knowledge of what it meant to face such a leviathan. Stories circulated in whispers of boats smashed to kindling, crews drowned beneath an enraged beast, men dragged under by fouled lines. There were tales of whales turning on their hunters, charging the boats, even battering the ship itself. Not all of these were exaggerations. Some were scars still visible in the timber. The harpoon bound man to whale in a contract of blood, and it was a contract few walked away from unchanged. A sailor could not forget the look of the whale's eye as it died, vast and unreadable, reflecting sky and man alike. They spoke of it quietly, when the night was calm and the lamps burned low. How it felt to stand so close to something so immense, to drive iron into its flesh, to listen as it screamed through spout and thrash. Some claimed it looked back, as though aware, as though it understood. And in the end, what did it yield? Barrels of oil stacked below decks, waxed and sealed, the measure of profit, each one marked with blood, sweat, and memory. Yet the men remained hungry, still cramped in hammocks among strangers, still lashed by storms, still bound to endless labor. The whale's death did not ease their suffering. It only extended the voyage, promised more hunts, more dangers, more shadows of the harpoon. For those imagining adventure, imagining triumph. The reality was this. The hunt was no heroic battle. It was a desperate struggle in which the line between hunter and hunted blurred. The harpoon cut both ways. It killed whales, but it destroyed men too. Slowly, silently, piece by piece. Every time the iron left a sailor's hand, it left a mark on his soul. The voyage was survival only by the narrowest margin, and in the shadow of the harpoon, survival itself began to feel like something less than living. The carcass drifted astern, stripped and gutted, its white ribs gleaming like the bones of a drowned cathedral. Gulls wheeled above, sharks tore below, and the sea rolled on without pause. But there was no rest for the men who had brought it down. Their hammocks still smelled of grease and smoke. Their arms still trembled from the lances, yet the masthead was never left empty. The sea gave, and the sea demanded again. Another spout could appear at any moment, and every man knew that each sighting might not lead to a feast of profit, but to their own ruin. The harpoon was not always master. Sometimes it was invitation. The sea was filled with creatures that did not flee as prey should, but turned with a fury born of blood and thunder. Tales told in candlelit forecastles of shattered boats and broken men were not sailors' fancies. They were warnings etched in scar and splinter, for whales, when struck, did not always run. Sometimes they fought. There was one such encounter that lived in the marrow of every voyage. A pod of sperm whales sighted at dawn, their blows rising like chimneys against the paling sky. Boats were lowered with haste, men pulling until blisters split, the memory of the last carcass still raw in their nostrils. The sea was calm, deceptively kind, as they closed the distance. The first harpoon flew true, burying its barb in the dark flank of a bull. Instead of fleeing, the bull turned. It spun in the water with a speed that belied its size, the wake frothing white. Its flukes came down with the force of thunder, sending walls of water over the boat. The line screamed through the bow notch, then went slack, not because the whale had fled, but because it was coming for them. Men scrambled to backwater to turn the boat aside, but they were too slow. The whale surged forward, jaws gaping, barnacled head crashing into oak with the impact of a cannonball. The boat split down the middle. Oars flew. Men tumbled into the sea, flailing, gasping, clutching at fragments of timber. Some were dragged down by the very line they had set, snared around limbs, yanked beneath the blood-dark water before their cries could reach the air. Others swam for their lives, their arms heavy with exhaustion, their ears filled with the roar of the whale's passage. The survivors clawed back aboard the mother ship, half drowned, coughing seawater and spitting blood. Their boat was gone, splinters scattered across miles. And the whale, it lingered, circling just beyond reach, spouting defiantly, as if to remind them that the balance of hunter and hunted was never settled. The sea did not grant easy victories. There were worse tales still. Men remembered the ship Essex, struck by a furious bull in the vast Pacific. The whale rammed the hull itself, not once, but twice, with such violence that timbers cracked, seams opened, and the vessel foundered. The crew scattered into open boats, left adrift across an ocean with little more than starvation for company. Some were consumed by the sea, others by madness, and some, when hunger became an unbearable tyrant, were consumed by one another. That memory clung to every whaler like a second skin, that the ship itself was never beyond reach of the creatures they hunted. To sit in a fragile whaleboat, oar in hand, and see a beast longer than the mast, heavier than the ship, turn its eye upon you, was to know how thin the line of dominance truly was. The eye was what haunted men the most, not the fluke or the jaws, but that gaze. Vast, unblinking, ancient. It gave the impression of recognition, as though the whale did not merely strike in panic, but in judgment. The moment when prey became predator felt not like chance, but reckoning. Every harpoon cast carried that risk. A careless throw, a shallow strike, a missed lunge of the lance, and the boat could become coffin. Men were dragged beneath overturned hulls, pinned by wreckage, swallowed by the same ocean they had once thought theirs to command. And even if the beast did not strike, the sea itself often finished what it began. A capsized boat meant swimming in waters slick with blood, with sharks cutting shadows beneath. Many who escaped the whale met teeth instead. But the danger was not always violent. Sometimes it was worse in its patience. A wounded whale could sound, plunging straight down into the abyss, the line ripping after it in a blur of smoke and spray. If the rope fouled, it meant instant death. Men had been cleaved in two, their bodies snapped against the gunwales before being dragged into blackness. Others were hauled screaming over the side, vanishing so swiftly their comrades could do nothing but stare at the bubbles that rose after. Those deaths were whispered about more than any other, for they were silent, merciless, unheroic. The rope was as feared as the whale itself. The sea held no pity for the reckless. The harpoon was an oath that could not be broken. Once it struck flesh, the men were tied to whatever fate the beast chose, and sometimes that fate was slaughter. What haunted the men most deeply, though, was how deliberate it sometimes felt. When a whale turned upon them, there was no frenzy in its movements. It was swift, yes, and terrible, but not mindless. It seemed to know where to strike, to sense the fragile points of wood and bone. A fluke laid squarely across the beam, a head driven directly at the keel, a jaw snapping oars as though they were reeds. They swore in the dim lamplight that the beasts learned, that wordless knowledge passed among them, that vengeance had a lineage of its own. And what could men do? They still lowered the boats, still sharpened the irons, still chased the spouts. To refuse was to starve. Oil was profit, profit was life, and there was no escape but the sea itself. So they rowed, even knowing each strike might invite their deaths. Each harpoon thrown was a wager placed against the abyss. The hunt was never one-sided. No matter how many barrels filled the hold, no matter how many carcasses drifted away to sink, the balance could tip in an instant. A voyage that began with ambition could end with a ship adrift, her crew lost, her story swallowed whole by waves and memory. To sit on that deck, to row in that boat, was to understand why survival was so rare. The sea was vast, the whales vaster still, and man's weapons were little more than sharpened scraps of iron. Courage was demanded, but courage was not enough. Many had courage, they still drowned, they still burned, they still vanished into the dark, unmarked graves beneath indifferent waves. And so the shadow of the harpoon carried not only the certainty of labor and blood, but the unspoken truth that sometimes the roles reversed. Sometimes the whale became the hunter, and the men, tattered, trembling, clinging to splintered wood, were nothing but prey. It was a truth every sailor knew, but none dared speak aloud, except in those restless hours when lanterns guttered low and the sea whispered against the hull. A truth that pressed itself into bone with every launch, every strike, every scream, that the sea had never belonged to men. It belonged to the leviathans. And when they chose to turn, no harpoon in the world could save you. The wreckage of the hunt did not end when the sea swallowed the carcass, or when the boats dragged back what remained of their strength. The truest trial began after the irons were driven home, after the beast had stilled, when its vast body lay tethered to the ship like a floating island of flesh. Victory was never clean. It was viscera and smoke, fat and fire. It was oil, thick, rancid, clinging oil that men pursued across oceans. And it was oil that turned the vessel itself into a floating abattoir. The first cuts were made while the carcass still bobbed in the swell, a grotesque raft alongside the hull. Men climbed down onto its slippery hide, their boots sinking into layers of blubber that gave way like rotten fruit. With long-handled spades and knives, they carved into the whale's skin, hauling up great strips of fat called blanket pieces, each weighing hundreds of pounds. The sea turned white with floating scraps, slick with grease, as gulls shrieked and sharks tore at what was left. On deck, the crew worked the windlass, hoisting those slabs aboard with block and tackle. the pieces slapped wetly onto planks already blackened with gore. There they were hacked into smaller hunks, cut down to horse pieces, and then into thin slices called Bible leaves, so named because they resembled pages torn from a book, though these pages were greasy, stinking, and reeking of decay. The men's hands blistered from the work, their clothes soaked through until no scrubbing could drive the smell from the fibers. The stench crept into skin and hair, into food and hammock, into the marrow itself, a companion that lingered longer than fear. Yet the cutting was only the beginning. The real torment came in the trying out, the rendering of flesh into oil, iron tripods, massive cauldrons set into a brick hearth on the deck, were fed with kindled scraps of blubber and wood until the fire roared. Into them went the slices, melting down into golden liquid that sloshed and spat with a heat that blistered any skin too close. The ship itself became a factory of smoke, flame and grease, reeking so powerfully it could be scented downwind for miles. There was no pause. Night and day, the process went on, men feeding the pots, skimming off froth and scraps, ladling the molten oil into cooling casks. Sleep was snatched in minutes, meals eaten with hands slick from fat, and every breath drew in smoke that stung the lungs. Sparks showered across the deck, and every man knew the danger. A rogue wave, a careless slip, and the whole vessel could become an inferno. The sea offered no rescue to a burning ship. The stench was beyond language. Even men hardened to bilge water and rot, to the sourness of unwashed bodies, recoiled from it. It was a smell that seemed to coat the inside of the mouth, a bitterness that clung to the tongue, so that even water tasted rancid. The oil itself, though precious in the counting houses of far-off cities, was loathed by those who made it. It seeped into everything, into hammocks, into hair, into the very grain of the deck. Rats, emboldened by the scraps, swarmed the scuppers at night, their fur glistening with grease. The work scarred the men. Fire popped and hissed, spraying droplets of molten fat onto bare arms and faces, leaving burns that healed poorly in the salt air. Blubber smoke filled the lungs until coughing racked the body raw. Cuts from knives and spades festered quickly, for oil and grime bred infection faster than any clean wound. A slip on the greasy deck could mean a man overboard, vanishing into a slick that no hand could grip, and there was no respite from the smell. It clung to the men even ashore, months after they returned. Townsfolk could pick out whalemen by scent alone. Wives and children recoiled at embraces. Some said it never left, that once oil touched you, you carried its ghost until the grave. To live with that reek was to know that the pursuit of profit had made you into something less than human, a creature marked by decay. Still, the casks filled, and that was all that mattered to captains and owners. Each barrel stowed below was coin in the counting house, lamplight in parlours, lubrication for the machines of an age hungry for industry. But for the men who sweated and choked to make it, the barrels might as well have been coffins. They represented not wealth, but time stolen from flesh, from sleep, from health, from dignity. Every drop of oil carried with it a toll measured in burns, in coughs, in bones bent by ceaseless labour. At night the try-works glowed like a forge, their fire staining the sails a ruddy orange, turning the ship into a phantom on the sea. From afar, it must have looked like a drifting volcano, a creature not of wood and rope, but of fire and smoke. Up close it was worse. The heat oppressive, the stench unbearable, the men blackened with soot, their faces gleaming with sweat and grease. They were less crew than shades, labouring in a floating hell. Even food bore the mark of oil. The meat and biscuit were greasy, the water tainted. Rats grew fat and bold, gnawing at barrels, crawling across hammocks at night, sometimes biting the very men they shared the deck with. Disease spread easily in such conditions, and fevers burned hotter than the tripods. A cough could carry a man off more swiftly than a whale's fluke, and there was no physician, only whatever bitter draughts the captain might dole from his chest. To survive this was not simply to endure labour, but to surrender the senses themselves. Sight blurred from smoke, taste spoiled by rancid air, touch calloused into numbness. smell obliterated until only the stench of oil remained. Even the sound of the sea, once steady, was drowned out by the constant crackle of fire and the groan of men at the windlass. It was a life where nothing clean remained, and yet they endured, because endurance was demanded. Oil meant wages, wages meant survival, though rarely for the men themselves, who often returned with little more than scars and stories. The owners profited, the merchants prospered, the cities gleamed with light, while the men who had fed the trypots coughed themselves into early graves. If storms broke their bones, and whales broke their boats, the oil broke their spirits. It was the slowest, cruelest torment of the voyage, to work beside death and flame, to be marked by a smell fouler than the grave, to become something unrecognizable even to oneself. For the whaleman's world was not merely shaped by sea and beast, but by the oil itself, oil that promised wealth for others and only suffering for those who drew it from the carcass. It was oil that stank worse than death, and in its smoke, men learned how thin the line truly was between the living and the damned. The fire of the trypots had not yet cooled when another danger stirred, one quieter than smoke, but far swifter in its sentence. If blubber and oil blackened the skin and lungs, it was the rope that hunted the body in silence. Few men feared it at first. It seemed so ordinary, coiled in neat piles along the deck, humming faintly when the wind tugged at the rigging. Yet every whaleman knew, sooner or later, the line would claim its due. The rope was everywhere. Hemp spun hard and tarred black. It wrapped the ship like sinew around bone. Blocks creaked with its weight. Sails bellied at its command. Anchors rose and fell with its pull. But it was in the whale line that danger lay most cruelly. That long coil, fastened to harpoon and boat, snaked across thwarts and deck, waiting to sing. At rest, it looked harmless, brown fiber piled in careful spirals. In motion, it became a living thing, faster than breath, harder than iron, a whip that cut flesh to the bone, or dragged a man screaming into the sea. The killing was never dramatic in the way storms broke masts or whales stove boats. It was sudden, efficient, almost indifferent. A careless foot placed on the bight of line, a hand too near a coil when the whale sounded, and the man was gone. The line seized him with a speed no reflex could match. Fingers snapped, wrists crushed, shoulders wrenched from sockets. More often, he was yanked clean from the boat, carried under before a cry had left his lips. The sea boiled for a moment, then closed again, as if it had always intended to swallow him. Others fared worse, for survival did not always mean rescue. Sometimes the line caught only part of a man, a hand, a forearm, the lower half of a leg. It twisted, tightened, and sheared with a butcher's indifference. Men came back from the hunt missing fingers, stumps wrapped in rags stiff with blood, their lives spared but forever marked by the rope's claim. There was no greater silence aboard a whaler than after the rope took someone. Men stood stunned, staring at the empty spot on the thwart or the coil still quivering with the speed of its run. No one spoke, for what words could be offered? The sea had taken its toll, and work went on, because it had to. The whale line did not forgive hesitation. It was not only in the hunt that rope killed. High in the rigging, men worked barefoot, gripping tarred lines with toes and fingers, hauling canvas in storms that whipped the sails like thunder. One slip, and the same rope that bore their weight became their noose. A body falling from aloft rarely survived the strike of deck or sea. Those who lived were twisted, broken things, carried below to die slow among groans and shadows. Even the simplest duties carried risk. The anchor cable, thick as a man's thigh, could snap under strain, its recoil cutting men in two. The windlass and capstan, worked by sweating bodies heaving in rhythm, could crush a hand if it slipped between powel and drum. Knots themselves became hazards, swelling wet and hard, impossible to undo, cutting into flesh like stone. What made the rope so deadly was its invisibility as danger. Storms gave warning, whales gave chase, disease gave fever. Rope did not warn. It struck in an instant and was finished before men even knew to curse. And so every man aboard lived with a quiet dread, watching his step, eyeing each coil, knowing his life was strung on hemp. There was a kind of superstition about it. Some said the rope had memory, that it kept tally of each man's carelessness, waiting for the day he forgot himself. Others swore the rope chose its victims, always the youngest, or the boldest, or the most unlucky. Men avoided stepping across coils, no matter how urgent the task. To place a foot in a bight was to tempt fate. To joke about it was to invite doom. The worst deaths were those no one could stop. A whale sounding deep, the line running out with a shriek against the loggerhead, and a man's leg caught fast. The crew would hack at the rope with knives, but too late. The body was already overboard, dragged fathoms down into blackness where lungs burst and bones crushed. Sometimes the man surfaced days later, bloated, rope still cutting into his flesh. More often, he was never seen again, gone as surely as if the sea had erased his name. The scars told the tale as much as the graves. Old whalemen carried twisted hands, fingers missing at the knuckle, arms that hung limp with ruined nerves. These were badges of survival, reminders that the rope had taken its due but spared their lives. To younger men, they were warnings. To captains, they were costs of business. No voyage ended without them. The terror of rope was that it made the sea itself a conspirator. One misstep, and man and line were bound together, one pulled by the weight of the other. The ocean, indifferent, open to receive them both. No heroism, no resistance, only silence. And the coil lying slack again as though nothing had happened. And yet, for all this, rope was the very thing that held the voyage together. Without it, sails would not draw, anchors would not hold, whales would not be struck, oil would not be hoisted aboard. It was both lifeline and executioner, salvation and doom spun into the same fibers. The ship lived by it, and men died by it, and there was no separating one from the other. If fire marked the voyage with smoke, and oil with stench, rope marked it with blood. The men knew it, though few spoke of it. The ocean took its toll in storms, in hunger, in whales that fought back. But most often, it was the rope that wrote the final sentence, quick, silent, merciless. That was the truth of the voyage. Not only whales rising from the deep, not only storms blackening the horizon, but the ever-present, ever-waiting danger at their feet. For every man who signed aboard, the rope lay coiled already, patient, ready, a hand of the sea itself stretched out to claim what was owed. And so they worked, and so they watched, knowing every haul, every knot, every drag of line was a gamble. Some survived with scars, some did not survive at all. In the end, it was not only whales that hunted men, nor seas that broke them, but the very cords that bound ship and life together. Hands were lost, arms were taken, lives were dragged beneath waves. The voyage demanded it, and the rope delivered. No prayer, no caution, no strength could prevent it forever. To sail on a whaler was to live with death coiled at your feet, humming with every shift of wind, waiting with every strike of iron. The sea's cruelty was not always in its storms or its beasts. Sometimes it was in the silence of a rope, in the sudden pull, in the vanishing of a man whose place would be filled before the next dawn. That was why you would not survive. Not the whale, not the weather, but the simple, terrible rope that bound the voyage together and tore the men apart. The sea claimed its victims with rope and storm, but it was within the cramped wooden body of the ship that another predator thrived. Disease needed no harpoon, no gale, no pull of the line. It required only flesh and breath, and aboard a whaler there was plenty of both. Men lived pressed shoulder to shoulder, hammocks slung so tightly in the forecastle that one could hear the heartbeat of the man beside him. The air below decks was never fresh. It hung thick with the odors of sweat, damp wool, unwashed bodies, and the sour tang of salted meat beginning to spoil. In that stale darkness, a cough was not just a cough. It was the opening shot of a siege that would spread faster than the rumors carried in from distant ports. Whalers were not healthy men to begin with. Before they set sail, many came from the gutters of port cities, already worn down by hunger, drink, or poverty. They boarded with teeth already loose, with lungs already scarred by smoke or dust. The voyage only stripped them further. Weeks without green food carved gums into bleeding sores. Bodies grew weak, skin yellowed, bones ached as if they had aged decades in months. Scurvy was not a distant possibility, but an inevitability, the slow wasting curse of the sea. A single rotten barrel of provisions could doom half a crew. Meat salted too lightly, bread crawling with weevils, water caked with green scum. These were meals, not exceptions. There was no doctor aboard, only the captain's meagre chest of laudanum, opium pills, and saws sharp enough to amputate but too crude to heal. If sickness came, a man was told to sweat it out, or to swallow rum and keep to his hammock. But hammocks touched, and breaths mingled, and soon one fever became 20. The voyage was long, the world wide, and ports few. Months could pass with no land in sight. When disease broke out, there was no help. A man who shivered with chills at dawn might be a corpse by nightfall, his body sewn into canvas and slid into the sea while his shipmates muttered half-remembered prayers. Yet death itself was not the worst fear. Worse was the sickness that did not kill, but lingered. Dysentery that chained men to buckets. Coughing fits that racked ribs until blood flecked the lips. Sores that ate into flesh and would not close. And all of it spread with a speed that mocked discipline. One man's cup shared by another. One bunkmate's rag borrowed. One hand on the same rail. And the illness leapt like fire from body to body. Rumors could be ignored, but disease carried proof in sweat and fever. There was a cruel irony in the hunt itself. The work of boiling blubber only worsened sickness. The air thick with rancid smoke clung to lungs already weakened by cold and salt. The oil slicked everything, hands, hammocks, even the food when a careless splash struck the galley fire. Men breathed it, tasted it, wore it into their skin until their pores seemed to ooze it back out. Coughs deepened, chests rattled, eyes burned raw. Even those untouched by fever staggered as if drunk, dizzy from the fumes that never lifted. The ship became a floating infirmary, without nurses or medicine. Men too weak to climb aloft still had to haul line. Those doubled over with cramps were ordered to row after whales. The work did not pause for illness. The ship demanded hands whether they trembled or not. And so sickness spread most efficiently in labor itself. The sweat-soaked grips, the strained breath, the shared strain of the rope that carried both whale and fever alike. There was no mercy in command. Captains measured value in barrels of oil, not in the health of men. A sick crewman was dead weight until he either recovered or went overboard wrapped in canvas. Stories spread of ships that carried so many ill that only a handful were left to man the sails. Some never returned, drifting ghost-like until another vessel found them. Crew rotted where they had fallen. Others limped into port with holds half full and decks half empty, their surviving men little more than scarecrows with eyes sunken deep. But the sea was not finished, for sickness alone was not content. There was always the chance of injury joining hands with infection. A simple cut from the rope, a blister from the oar. These could fester in days, swelling until the skin burst with pus. Gangrene was a sentence, an amputation a desperate gamble. A saw biting into bone without chloroform or clean instruments was survival only in name. Few who endured such operations lived long. The wound turned black, fever raged, and the ship carried one more body to the sea. Sailors whispered of curses, of voyages doomed by a single touch of plague. But it needed no curse. Only men living as animals in a wooden box adrift on salt water. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no one to tend them but each other. Yet compassion was thin when survival demanded distance. A sick man might find himself avoided, his hammock shifted farther from the others, his tools left untouched. The greatest loneliness was not in death, but in the days before it, when his shipmates looked at him with the wary eyes of men who knew they might be next. The ocean offered no kindness either. Salt air did not cleanse wounds, it salted them raw. The spray carried chill deep into the bones of men already weak, and the endless damp turned clothing into rags that never dried. Each drop of rain was another chance for fever, each gust of wind another knife in lungs worn thin. And when land finally appeared, when the long months ended in some foreign harbour, the danger only multiplied. Ports were fever-ridden, crowded with sailors from other ships, each carrying his own cargo of sickness. A night ashore could bring syphilis, cholera, or worse. Men staggered back aboard with pleasures bought in alleys and fevers that would soon burn through hammocks like fire through oil-soaked rags. Disease, more than storms or whales or ropes, proved the great equalizer. The strongest harpooner, the most seasoned mate, the toughest deckhand. None could resist once the sickness caught. And in that weakness lay the true cruelty of the voyage. The sea broke bodies, but disease broke the will. To feel one's own strength slipping day by day, to taste rot in one's mouth, to sweat and shiver in darkness while the ship rolled on uncaring. That was the torment that hollowed men out before they ever reached home. Sickness was the shadow that never left the whaler's deck. It clung to hammocks, crept into food, drifted in the smoke, whispered in coughs. Men learned to fear the sound of a throat clearing, the sudden silence of a bunk left cold. It spread faster than rumors, faster than the wind filled the sails, faster than prayers could be spoken. It was the sea's most invisible weapon, and perhaps its most merciless. If sickness stripped a man's strength, it was discipline that tore at his spirit. Aboard a 19th century whaler, the sea was not the only master. Above the men loomed the captain, a figure carved in iron by years of hunger, storms, and oil-slicked decks. His word was law, and his justice was not the calm gavel of a court, but the sting of rope across flesh, the weight of humiliation before one's crew. The whaling voyage was a furnace of misery, storms, hunger, sickness, fear, and in that furnace, tempers burned hot. Captains, entrusted with cargo and profit, saw their crew not as men but as tools, living pulleys and levers in the hunt for oil. Tools, when they broke or faltered, were mended harshly or discarded. A sailor's back became both work and warning. Stripes of blood across skin to remind every other man where defiance would lead. It did not take much to invite the lash. A missed knot, a stumble aloft, a moment of hesitation when the cry of "There she blows!" demanded speed. Even illness was treated with suspicion. A man too weak to climb the rigging might be called a shirker, accused of malingering, and punished into obedience. The sea offered no patience for weakness, and captains even less. The lash was not symbolic. It was a weapon, thick ropes soaked in salt and swung with practiced fury. A dozen strokes could peel the skin from a man's shoulders, leaving welts that festered in the damp air. Blood mixed with sweat, and salt water bit into open wounds until men trembled not from pain alone, but from the certainty of infection that might follow. Those stripes marked more than flesh. They marked a sailor's place, reminding him that he was less than free, bound by fear as much as contract. Discipline, the captains claimed, kept a ship from chaos, and there was truth in it. The sea allowed no democracy. A single moment of hesitation in storm or hunt could doom all aboard. Yet captains, hardened by years where mercy meant weakness, wielded authority with a cruelty that bled into tyranny. A sharp tongue escalated into a clenched fist, a minor disobedience into a flogging so severe the man could not work for days afterward. Still, the ship demanded work, and so the injured laboured, bloodied backs pressed against coarse canvas, salt stiffening every tear in the flesh. The whaling ship was a paradox. Men relied on one another utterly, yet were pitted against one another under the captain's gaze. Officers, keen to curry favour, pushed harder than needed. Sailors, desperate not to be the next victim, obeyed orders to lash their own mates. The cruelty multiplied not by the hand of the captain alone, but by the structure of command itself, turning shipmate against shipmate until brotherhood dissolved into silence and suspicion. The lash was not the only punishment. Starvation rations, extra duty in the boiling sun beside the try-works, isolation in a dark hold, these were tools of control. But the lash carried a special power, for it was public. When a man was tied to the grating or mast, every other sailor was ordered to watch. The whip cracked not only on the punished, but across the hearts of all who stood silent, eyes fixed forward, knowing they might be next. Some captains revelled in it, their tempers legendary in the ports they haunted. Tales spread of men beaten to death, of mutinies sparked by too much cruelty, of voyages that ended not with profit, but with blood spilled upon the deck. Yet such stories did not deter others. Brutality was excused as necessity, even admired as strength. The sea, they said, was no place for softness, but softness was what men longed for most, and its absence hollowed them as surely as hunger. The lash was never forgotten. Wounds healed into scars, raised ropes of flesh that crossed shoulders and backs. Each scar was a record, a silent ledger of pain carried home to port. Families who embraced their returning sailors felt those ridges beneath the shirt and knew something of the voyage, even if the men themselves said little. For whalemen were not poets. They spoke with silence, with drink, with fists, but the scars told their own histories. And yet, submission did not always breed safety. Sometimes defiance erupted, quick and bloody. A sailor pushed too far might strike back, his fist or knife driven by rage that had fermented over months of salt and smoke. Such acts rarely ended well. Mutiny was the greatest crime at sea, punished with hangings or imprisonment if the ship reached port. But in the vast emptiness of the ocean, punishment could be swifter. A man cast overboard in the dark, reported later as lost to the sea. The lash was as much a part of whaling as the harpoon. One drove iron into the whale, the other into the men who hunted it. Both spilled blood, both left marks, both were justified as necessary for survival. The cruelty of the sea and the cruelty of command blurred together until they were indistinguishable. And always, behind the captain's wrath, lay the constant pressure of profit. Every barrel of oil meant wealth in faraway cities, and every delay was lost money. A sick man, a faltering crew, a hesitant harpooner, all were threats not only to discipline but to commerce. The lash was business, as much a tool of industry as the try-works fire or the blubber hook. It kept the voyage moving, no matter how many men it broke along the way. But discipline was a double-edged blade. Men driven too hard, too often, became dangerous in their own way. Silent resentment smouldered below decks. Whispers of rebellion crept through the hammocks at night. Knives were sharpened, not for whales, but for the flesh of those who held the whip. The history of whaling is thick with such shadows. Captains found dead in their cabins, officers vanishing at sea, ships mysteriously adrift with their command overthrown. These were rare, but they were real, proof that even iron could crack when bent too far. Still, for the ordinary sailor, survival meant submission. To endure the voyage, one learned to bow one's head, to bear the lash in silence, to swallow rage like sour rum. The scars became part of the body, the pain another rhythm of life, no different from the creak of timbers or the crash of waves. Men did not dream of justice, only of the day when land appeared and they could stumble ashore with coin enough to drink the memory away. The ocean consumed flesh with rope, with cold, with sickness, but the captain consumed spirit. His wrath fell swift as storm, his lash cut deeper than salt, and his power was absolute. Aboard a whaler, you were not only at the mercy of the sea, you were at the mercy of a man who believed himself its equal, and in that belief lay the harshest truth of all. Survival was not only about enduring whales, storms, and hunger, but about outlasting the will of a master who saw you not as human, but as one more piece of expendable rigging. The sea broke bodies, the lash broke souls, and together they made whaling a voyage few could survive whole. The sea already claimed its share of men. It gnawed with salt sores, starved with rationed bread, fevered with invisible illness. Yet, for those who survived those afflictions, there remained another force just as dangerous: the will of the captain. He was not simply the master of the ship, but the arbiter of pain, judge and executioner of discipline, wielding rope and iron with the certainty of a man convinced that cruelty was the only barrier against collapse. A whaling ship was no democracy. From the moment the articles were signed in some waterfront tavern, every man surrendered not just his labor, but his body. The voyage stretched into years, and in that time, there was no magistrate, no appeal, no recourse, but the captain's mood. On calm days, his power might feel distant, a figure glimpsed at the quarterdeck, voice carried on the wind. But when fury descended, it struck with a violence that rivaled the sea itself. Discipline was the spine of the vessel, or so it was said. Without it, the hunt faltered, and profit dissolved into ruin. Captains saw themselves as custodians of order, responsible for turning a handful of rough men from the gutters of Nantucket, New Bedford, or London into a crew capable of harpooning leviathans. But order carried a price, and that price was measured in blood and humiliation. The lash was the captain's favored instrument. Fashioned from rope hardened by salt, it was no light punishment. A dozen blows could slice through shirt and skin, laying open welts that burned like fire each time sweat or seawater touched them. Wounds did not heal cleanly in the damp, confined ship. They festered, swelling with infection, forcing men to work with every muscle screaming. Yet they worked. Fear drove them. Fear kept the masts manned and the boats launched when the cry of "There she blows" broke across the waves. Punishment was always public. A man tied to the grating became a spectacle, his suffering a warning. The crew stood silent, watching, knowing their turn might come for nothing more than a missed order or a poorly tied knot. Officers swung the lash with a steady hand, some with grim reluctance, others with something darker glittering behind their eyes. The captain's gaze never wavered. Each stroke reinforced not just his command, but the hierarchy that bound the men in place. It was not only negligence that drew wrath. Insolence, hesitation, or even sickness mistaken for laziness could provoke punishment. Men shivered not just from cold, but from the thought that weakness itself was treason. A sailor who faltered climbing the rigging during a gale might be beaten half to death afterward, as if the near fall were proof of rebellion rather than fatigue. Discipline demanded no excuses. There were captains whose tempers became legend in port taverns, men who flogged sailors until they collapsed, who drove their crews so mercilessly that mutiny smoldered below decks. Yet tales of cruelty rarely ended in justice. More often, they were folded into the myth of whaling itself, proof of how hard the sea required a man to be. Investors ashore cared for barrels, not backs. A ship that returned laden with oil erased the scars that carried it there. For the sailor, there was no erasure. Flesh remembered. Shoulders bore ridges like ropes stitched into skin. Each scar told its story, a map of pain carved across the body. Some men carried dozens, an archive of years under captains who measured obedience in stripes. They became walking testimonies, though their silence in port spoke louder than words. Families touched those raised scars beneath coarse shirts and understood, dimly, that the ocean had taken more than time. Punishment was not confined to the lash alone. Food withheld, water rationed, double watches in freezing rain. All were used to break stubbornness. A man might be confined below in darkness, left to choke on the stench of bilge water. But the lash remained supreme, for it struck swiftly, decisively, and left no doubt about authority. It was ritualized violence, a performance as much as a punishment, reminding all who watched that survival depended not only on harpoons and storms, but on submission to one man's will. And yet, obedience was not always secure. Beneath the surface, resentment festered. Sailors whispered in the dark of mutiny, their anger sharpened with every stroke of rope across flesh. Knives were hidden, fists clenched. Some captains vanished at sea under mysterious circumstances, swept overboard in storms that seemed oddly selective. A few ships limped into port crewless, their officers murdered and bodies consigned to the depths. Such stories were rare, but their existence spoke of a truth every sailor knew. Press a man too far, and even the lash could not contain him. Still, rebellion was dangerous, and most chose endurance. They bent their backs and bore the stripes, swallowed rage like bitter rum, and dreamed only of the day when they might stand on land again with coin enough to numb memory. To survive meant silence, submission, and scars, as much a part of the whaling voyage as the reek of oil or the thunder of surf. In the end, the captain's wrath was not separate from the sea, but an extension of it. The ocean broke bodies with storm and hunger. The captain broke spirits with lash and command. Together they forged an existence where cruelty was not exception, but necessity, where a man endured not only the elements, but the will of another, both equally merciless. The sea consumed flesh, the captain consumed soul, and in that terrible balance, a whaleman lived suspended, trapped between leviathans below and tyranny above, surviving only as long as his body held and his spirit refused to shatter. There were stretches in a voyage when the sea seemed endless, not because of storms or whales, but because of absence. No horizon but water, no sound but waves, no measure of time except the creak of wood and the rise of the sun. These were the weeks when the ship became an island adrift, when the men were not hunters but prisoners of blue infinity, and survival meant enduring not peril but monotony so vast it could drive a man into madness. The mind is a fragile thing when left with nothing but sameness. A sailor could stomach hunger, lashings, even sickness, but weeks without event gnawed differently. Whaling voyages stretched into years, and within those years there were voids of waiting, hunting grounds scoured empty, winds refusing to change, calms that stranded the vessel like a carcass drifting on a tide. The ocean mocked them with its immensity. To men who had once believed the world wide, the sea revealed instead its suffocating narrowness. A circle of deck, a line of water, a sky too vast to measure. During such weeks, days blurred, work was reduced to routine maintenance, patching sails already patched, scrubbing decks already scraped. The harpoons lay idle, oars stored, try-works cold. The smell of oil faded, replaced by the stench of sweat and unwashed flesh in cramped quarters below. Men carved scrimshaw from whale teeth, etched fantasies of women or ships into bone, or played endless games of cards with greasy fingers. Some sang to themselves, voices cracking into the silence. Others stared at the horizon until it stared back. Boredom was not harmless. It curdled into unrest. With no whale to chase, no storm to battle, tempers flared. Arguments over trifles, a stolen biscuit, a word muttered in passing, grew into fights that left blood on the planks. Officers watched with narrowed eyes, knowing too well that weeks without purpose could birth mutiny. A ship needed direction as much as wind. Without either, men lost their tether. And then there was the waiting for wind itself. Calm seas, deceptively gentle, were curses in disguise. Sails hung limp against the masts, rigging drooped, the ocean flat as hammered iron. Days under such calm were torture. Heat baked the deck until it blistered bare feet. Water supplies dwindled while barrels sat motionless, unable to refill. The ocean shimmered like glass, mocking thirst with its undrinkable vastness. Men went below to escape the sun, but the air there was stifling, thick with mildew and unwashed bodies. Every breath felt borrowed. The stillness magnified every discomfort. Rats scratched in the dark, cockroaches crawled across sleeping faces, lice chewed at scalps. In storm, these things could be ignored, In calm, they were unbearable. A single fly buzzed loud enough to drive a man into rage. The mind clawed for distraction and found none. Some men prayed. Others cursed the sky. A few whispered of desertion, though the idea of escape in open ocean was madness itself. Food, already rationed, became harder to stomach. Salt pork sweated grease, hardtack shattered teeth, and the same flavors repeated until the thought of swallowing another mouthful turned the stomach. Men chewed leather belts or gnawed wood out of desperation for something different. Dreams turned to feasts. Roasted meat, fresh bread, fruit-dripping juice. Visions so vivid that waking felt like cruelty. Hunger did not always mean empty stomachs. It meant emptiness of the soul, starved of variety. Sleep offered little mercy. Hammocks swung in the darkness. Bodies pressed close, air stale. Dreams and waking bled together. Time unraveled. Some men forgot which day it was, counting hours by the tolling of the ship's bell, but unable to recall what the count meant. The ship was their clock, and the sea ignored it. The sun rose and fell, but it brought no change. Superstition thrived in such silence. Men whispered that calm seas were curses laid by whales themselves, vengeful spirits slowing the ship until thirst or madness claimed the crew. Shadows seen in moonlight became omens. A gull circling overhead could inspire frenzy, as though it carried news of land. A single whale's spout in the distance could revive hope, though it often dissolved before the boats touched water. In monotony, imagination became both salvation and torment. The captain's authority grew brittle in these weeks. Orders to scrub or climb felt hollow when the sea refused to move. Men obeyed, but with resentment. Officers grew harsher, trying to enforce discipline through punishment, but even lashes could not summon wind. The crew's hatred turned inward, directed at each other, then outward, toward the very man who commanded them. It was in calms, not storms, that mutiny most often sprouted, and yet most endured. They endured because they had no choice. To leap overboard was to vanish, swallowed by a horizon that offered no salvation. They endured because even monotony was safer than the chaos of harpooning a whale. They endured because they had signed their names, and the sea was not done with them. But endurance came at a cost. The weeks of nothingness hollowed men from the inside, leaving shells that moved and worked but no longer felt alive. When whales finally returned, or storms rose, the crew threw themselves into the danger with a kind of relief, as if anything was better than waiting. Pain, fear, even death. All preferable to the endless stretch of water, the unbroken sameness of horizon, the crushing realization that the world had shrunk to a prison without walls. These were the weeks that revealed a truth as merciless as the lash or the storm. A man could drown without ever touching water, not by wave or rope, but by the suffocating weight of time itself, stretched across the ocean until every day became the same, until hope eroded grain by grain, like sand in an hourglass that never emptied. And still the sea went on, patient, infinite, watching as another crew drifted, another ship cracked beneath the weight of silence, and another handful of men learned what it meant to be swallowed not by depth, but by distance. There comes a point when the ocean's endless blue hardens into something else. The horizon, once water and sky, begins to glitter with white teeth, jagged and cruel, rising like mountains that drift. The crew knows at once that they have sailed too far north, into waters where whales are abundant, but the sea itself waits to devour. It is here, in the Arctic and the edges of Greenland, where the hunt becomes something other than man against beast. Here, the very ocean turns into a trap. The ice announces itself first in fragments, small floes, broken plates of frozen sea knocking against the hull like unwelcome visitors. At night they grind softly, the ship's timbers groaning at every impact. A sailor on watch will peer over the rail and see nothing but darkness. Then suddenly a pale glimmer. a shifting shape in the starlight, ice drifting silently past. At first it seems harmless, almost beautiful, but the men know better. Every shard is a messenger of what lies ahead. Days later, the horizon reveals its truth. The ship enters fields of pack ice stretching farther than the eye can reach. Chunks drift lazily, but their size dwarfs the vessel. Some rise like towers, taller than the mainmast, their bases hidden beneath the waterline, their jagged edges gleaming. They shift with invisible currents, colliding with each other in thunderous cracks. Between them, narrow lanes of water open and close without warning. To sail here is to enter a labyrinth that can change shape at any moment, where one wrong move means entrapment. The captain, standing rigid at the quarterdeck, must make decisions that no map or chart can guide. The ice moves according to its own will. Winds change direction, currents pull unpredictably, and what seems a safe passage 1 hour may close in the next. Orders come fast. Hard to starboard, trim the sails, heave to, while men scramble, knowing hesitation could mean death. For in these frozen fields, the ship is no longer master of itself. It is a guest in a house of shifting walls, walls that can crush it flat. The sound of ice closing around wood is unforgettable. First, the hull begins to groan, as though the ship itself senses its fate. Then comes the creak of timber under pressure, each board straining against its nails. Finally, when two floes meet and trap the vessel, there is a splintering crack that echoes like a gunshot. Men freeze in place, every muscle tight, listening to their ship's bones being bent. In those moments, no sailor thinks of whales or profit, only of survival, of whether the vessel will hold or splinter into kindling. And should the ice decide to crush, there is no defense. A whaling ship, for all its might against the ocean, is still wood, no thicker than a man's arm at its sides, built for speed and storage, not for siege. Against ice, it is as fragile as a beetle caught between stones. More than one vessel has been pinched in half, masts snapping like reeds, men leaping onto floes in desperation as their home of years was dragged beneath them. Survivors later told of the sea bubbling with oil from burst casks, mingled with splinters of oak and the cries of men who could not escape. Even without direct crushing, entrapment was its own curse. When ice closed around a ship, it could hold it prisoner for weeks, even months. The crew could do nothing but wait as the floes drifted, carrying them wherever the currents pleased. Provisions dwindled, fresh water ran low, and the men grew gaunt and hollow-eyed. Fires for cooking had to be rationed, for wood was precious when the ship might need repairs. The cold itself became the enemy. Breath froze in the air. Fingers cracked and bled from rope work. Frost formed on beards and did not melt for days. Some men went mad during these waits. To stand on deck and see the world nothing but white. No horizon, no water, just ice in every direction, was to realize how small and insignificant a ship truly was. Worse were the nights, when floes shifted in darkness, their grinding moans echoing like voices of the dead. Men lay in hammocks, unable to sleep, imagining the hull bursting beneath them, their bodies tossed into black freezing water. Those who dared to step onto the ice found no relief. It groaned beneath boots, cracked at the edges, and shifted with the tide. Some disappeared into sudden fissures, swallowed alive. Others wandered too far and became lost in a landscape without features, white upon white, until cold stiffened their legs and they dropped silently. The ice gave back nothing, yet still captains sought these waters. For where ice gathered, so too did whales. Bowheads and right whales, heavy with oil, fed in abundance among the floes. To risk the ice was to risk ruin, but also to court fortune. So boats were lowered even here, dodging chunks of floating ice, men rowing desperately to harpoon their prey before the floes closed again. Some boats were crushed between drifting slabs, oars snapped, men thrown into water that killed in minutes. The whales themselves sometimes fled beneath the ice, dragging lines taut until they snapped or pulling men into labyrinths from which they never emerged. Death by ice was slow and indifferent. It did not roar like a storm or rage like a whale. It pressed, it pinched, it waited. It reminded the men that nature's strength was not always in motion, but in stillness. A frozen sea had more power than any gale, for it robbed men of choice, of direction, of time itself. And when finally the ice released, when a lane opened by mercy of current or wind, the relief was tempered with scars. The ship's hull bore gouges deep as wounds. Masts strained from frost, sails stiff with rime. Men emerged thinner, older, their eyes shadowed. They had seen the sea's other face, the one colder than any storm, and they knew it could return without warning. What lingered most was the memory of sound, the thunder of floes colliding, the shriek of timber breaking, the hollow groans of a ship too small for the world it dared to enter. It was a reminder whispered in every sailor's ear that man might harpoon a whale, might lash a fellow sailor, might endure hunger and calm seas, but he would never conquer ice. Against that frozen weight, he was as helpless as an insect between fingers, waiting only for the squeeze. The ice eventually loosens its grip, but the men it has held never return to what they were. Weeks of creaking timbers and the threat of sudden crushing have left them hollow-eyed, their nerves stretched thin. Each face shows the lines of sleepless nights. Each hand trembles not only from the cold, but from something deeper, the knowledge that their lives are bound to a ship more fragile than they had believed. When the sea finally opens, it is not relief that fills the decks, but a heavier burden, despair that the voyage is far from over. The voyage itself is a prison. Time does not pass here in days or months, but in endless repetitions of labor, coiling lines, scrubbing decks, cutting blubber, bracing sails, watching horizons that yield nothing but more water. In that monotony, every small cruelty grows large. A missed ration of food, a shouted order barked without reason, the sting of a rope's end across a sailor's back. What begins as routine hardship becomes unbearable when stretched across years. And aboard these ships, there were always years. The men whisper in corners of the forecastle where lamplight barely reaches. Their words are half-breathed, careful as footsteps on thin ice, for walls here have ears. A wrong phrase overheard by a loyalist or officer could mean the lash, or worse. But whispers travel anyway. They flow between hammocks, over tin plates of salted beef, beneath the coughs of men too weak to rise. Resentment grows in silence, nourished not by single acts, but by their accumulation. It is the captain who becomes the target of this silent tide. To the owners back in port, he is the embodiment of authority and discipline, the guarantor of profit. To the crew, he is the weight pressing them into the dirt. When storms strike, he curses them as cowards. When sickness spreads, he tightens rations rather than eases them. When spirits wane, he offers not a word of comfort, only the promise of harsher lashings should duties falter. His figure looms not as a leader, but as a jailer. Men begin to watch him closely. Every step on deck, every decision, every careless gesture becomes fuel. They notice how he eats better than they do. A secret cut of meat kept for the cabin. They see his boots dry, while theirs rot from constant damp. They hear him speak of profits and barrels of oil, while their own bodies wither. The distance between officer and sailor becomes a canyon no bridge could span. But mutiny is not born in sudden fire. It is a slow fermentation. No one shouts rebellion openly. Instead, it begins with questions. How much longer can we survive this? What loyalty do we owe to a man who treats us worse than beasts? Whose ship is it, if not ours, who keep it afloat? These thoughts coil in minds that once accepted suffering as natural. And once such thoughts are spoken, they do not vanish. They linger, waiting, spreading like rot through the planks of a hull. Some men fantasize about violence, A knife slipped between ribs while the captain paces at night. A push overboard during a gale, when no one would notice until too late. But these ideas burn hot and vanish, for all know the cost of discovery. A mutineer caught before his time would not live to regret it. The lash could tear flesh to ribbons, but worse was the iron chains, confinement in darkness until landfall months away. And if landfall meant no more than a remote rock where the crew might abandon the condemned, so be it. Sailors knew stories of men marooned with nothing but a jug of water and the clothes on their backs, bones whitening under sun and gulls. The wiser ones, the older hands, do not call for daggers or sudden strikes. They preach patience. They speak of numbers, how only when the crew stands as one can the captain be defied. They remind their fellows that the first blow must be the last, that once raised, the banner of rebellion cannot be lowered. It is a game of all or nothing, and the sea gives no room for error. So the mutiny waits. It waits in silence, while the ship sails through calm seas, while the harpoons fly and the blood of whales stains the deck. It waits, while men bend their backs to tasks they hate, their minds elsewhere, imagining freedom or vengeance. They polish brass, they scrub planks, they obey orders, all while feeding the slow fire smouldering below their ribs. Telltale signs appear if one knows where to look. A gaze held too long between shipmates, a group huddled tighter than necessary around a lantern, a silence that falls suddenly when an officer approaches. The captain senses it, though he cannot name it. He grows harsher, barking more, punishing more swiftly, as though he can scourge disloyalty out of flesh. But this only feeds the beast. Every stripe from the cat o' nine tails etches not just pain, but resolve. Each cry under the lash is a promise whispered in clenched teeth. The sea offers its own trials in these weeks. Storms, hunger, endless fatigue. But these dangers pale beside the storm brewing within. For while gales batter from without, mutiny ferments from within, and no timber can withstand both. What fuels it most is not hatred alone, but hopelessness. The men begin to wonder if they will ever see land again. Voyages stretch not in months, but in years. A man who left a child in swaddling clothes may return to find him grown, if he returns at all. For many, there will be no return, only a grave in the sea or in the ice. And if that fate is all that waits, why not grasp at power now? Why not claim the ship for themselves, set course where they will, live or die by their own hand, rather than another's whip? The silence of mutiny is more dangerous than its cry. When voices finally rise, it is too late. A decision will have been made in some hidden hour, sealed with nods and stares. Knives will have been sharpened, belaying pins chosen for their weight. The moment will come when the ship sails through calm waters, when officers sleep unguarded, when lanterns burn low. Then silence will break in a rush of violence, sudden, brutal, and unstoppable. And if the mutiny succeeds, rarely does freedom follow. A captured ship must find harbour, and harbours are ruled by law. News travels swiftly across oceans, carried by every vessel that passes. A mutineer may run, may vanish into another port, but the gallows are patient. Many who raised their hands against captains ended their days swinging, their names cursed in every maritime court. Yet for the men trapped in the belly of the whaleship, even the gallows might seem sweeter than another year beneath the lash. The silence stretches, deepens, hardens. Each day it becomes less a question of if and more of when. The voyage continues, but every creak of the ship's timbers now carries two sounds: the familiar groan of wood against sea, and the quieter, more dangerous murmur of rebellion swelling beneath the surface, waiting for the hour when silence will end. Out on the open sea, weeks and months stretch into a blur. The mind begins to hunger not only for food, but for proof that other lives exist beyond the narrow confines of deck and mast. When the horizon finally breaks, when another shape rises on the rim of the world, it feels at first like deliverance. A ship, sails blooming against the sky, hull lifted by the swell. A reminder that the world has not been swallowed whole. But what approaches is not always salvation. In the age of whaling voyages, the ocean gave birth to apparitions. Derelicts adrift without hand upon their wheel, vessels limping under ragged canvas, hulls burned black with fire, decks slick with decay. To glimpse such a thing was to stare into one's own possible fate. A mirror in water, reflecting the doom that waits should fortune shift only slightly. The first sign is silence. A living ship hums with noise, the creak of ropes, the crack of oars, the clatter of boots. But sometimes a vessel glides across the sea with no such voice, moving under wind as if guided by the hand of some unseen master. Its sails may hang in tatters, its rigging sagging like cobweb. No signal flag greets the eye. No figures pace the deck. Only the gulls circle, shrieking, and the stench arrives before the ship itself. When a crew dared approach, they found the truth. Corpses slumped against the bulwarks, stiffened where they had fallen. Hammocks cradling the long dead. Galley fires long cold. Pots rusting with untouched food. Sometimes the men had gone overboard one by one, leaping into the sea in despair or delirium, until none remained. Sometimes disease had passed through, swift and merciless, leaving the vessel crewless but intact, sails pulling her onward in blind obedience to wind and tide. A ghost ship did not have to be entirely abandoned. Sailors spoke of vessels whose crews still walked the decks, but whose eyes seemed hollowed by fever. Ships where voices answered hail with cracked whispers, warning others away lest the pestilence spread. In such moments, prudence demanded distance. To board such a vessel was to invite death onto your own. Better to let it drift, a coffin borne by waves. Yet desperation often outweighed caution. A whaler low on fresh water or provisions might risk sending a boat, hoping to salvage supplies from the wreck of another's misfortune. Those who climbed aboard found horror waiting. Cabins where logbooks trailed off mid-sentence, ink smeared by trembling hands. Decks where rats scurried fat and fearless, feeding on what the dead had left behind. Whaleboats stowed but never launched, as though the crew had lost even the will to flee. Men carried the memory of these encounters for life. To sleep after seeing a ghost ship was nearly impossible. In dreams, they heard the groan of a rudder turning with no helmsman, the flap of canvas above a silent deck, the drip of stagnant water in the bilge. They imagined themselves abandoned in kind, their own vessel someday drifting nameless across the sea, glimpsed by strangers who would mutter prayers and steer away. The ocean has always been generous with fear, but ghost ships struck a deeper chord because they bore proof of how fragile human order truly was. A whaler is already a fragile kingdom afloat, its population ruled by discipline and the thin line of authority. But once that discipline cracks, chaos spreads faster than fire. Hunger, thirst, scurvy, fever, despair, any of these could reduce a full crew to the silence of death within weeks. And unlike storms or whales, these enemies strike from within, invisible until too late. Superstition thrived in such conditions. Some sailors swore ghost ships were not natural derelicts but omens, sent to warn those who saw them. A pale light was said to flicker at their mastheads, a spectral glow that no lantern produced. Others claimed they could hear voices when the wind carried right, fragments of hymns or cries, as if the dead still called out across the waves. To encounter one was thought by many to mark the ship next in line for disaster. Even more chilling were the tales of vessels that vanished only to return years later. A whaler gone missing might reappear without warning, drifting into shipping lanes, its hull weathered but intact. When boarded, every logbook would stop at a date long past. No skeletons, no signs of struggle, only absence, as if the crew had stepped over the side and walked into the sea. Such ships entered maritime legend, carried from port tavern to port tavern, as proof that the ocean takes as it pleases, without need for reason. And so, Each sighting gnawed at morale. When a lookout cried that another ship was on the horizon, hearts first leapt. Perhaps news from home, perhaps a chance to send letters, perhaps relief. But if the vessel drew closer and revealed its true nature, hope collapsed into dread. The men would work in uneasy silence for days after, haunted not only by what they had seen, but by the knowledge that their own voyage might end the same way. For those already broken by months at sea, the vision of a ghost ship was sometimes enough to shatter the mind entirely. A sailor might refuse to eat, convinced that death was now inevitable. Others muttered prayers at every creak of the rigging, certain the spirits of the abandoned had followed them aboard. The officers scoffed, but they too tightened their lips when such hulks slid across the water, for they knew well how close their own command always stood to ruin. What made survival nearly impossible in such a world was not the ghost ship itself, but what it represented. It was the tangible reminder that the sea demanded complete obedience, and even then gave no promises. A ship with strong masts and full sails could become a drifting tomb within a fortnight. It did not require a hurricane or an iceberg. Only a few days without water, a sickness carried by rats, a fire in the hold, a quarrel that turned to knives. The ghost ships on the horizon carried messages that no one wished to hear, that all the discipline, the lashings, the prayers, and the superstitions meant nothing if fortune turned her face. And yet those aboard a whaler could not look away, for they knew the truth too well. The derelict was not some distant story. It was their shadow. Thus the voyage pressed on, each man rowing, hauling, cutting, and bleeding, with the unspoken knowledge that his labour might end, not in a triumphant return to port, but in silence. His own body, left to rock with the swells as gulls circled, while his ship sailed on without him, waiting to become another pale apparition on the horizon for the next weary crew to fear. The cruelest truth of a 19th century whaling voyage was not the storms, nor the lash, nor even the hunger that hollowed men out until their shadows seemed sharper than their bodies. The true torment was time itself, not the days and weeks, but the years, stretched so thin that the mind eventually lost hold of what an ending was supposed to mean. A voyage could be promised at 3 years, but ships often returned at 5. Some did not return at all. What began as a departure with music in the streets and flags snapping from the masts became, months later, a blur of unchanging ocean and routines, repeated until they fused into one endless day. For those who endured, it seemed less like a journey and more like a sentence, a punishment with no clear release. The ocean offered no landmarks, no towns, no markers by which to chart human progress. One sunrise was like another, one sunset the same as yesterday's. Men awoke at bells, worked by bells, slept by bells. Even the storms became repetitions, one more test of soaked canvas and flooded deck, until memory itself grew tired of recording them. What little time had meant on land, the season of harvest, the festival, the birthdays of children, eroded into formlessness. The voyage did not move forward so much as circle endlessly in salt and wind. Letters from home, when they came at all, arrived only if a ship was lucky enough to meet another bound for port. A sailor might open a packet sealed years before, only to read of a child who had been a toddler when he left, but now ran about as if he were a stranger. Worse still, a wife's words might tell of sickness already ended by death, or of fields lost to debt, or of a brother hanged for crime. And there was no way to answer, only the silent ache of knowing life continued elsewhere without them. The cruelest letters were the ones that spoke of forgetting, a wife who wrote without endearments, her tone polite but distant, a friend who mentioned news as if to someone no longer expected to return, the slow recognition that a man's place on shore had already been filled by others, another worker, another husband, another father figure, and the sailor, trapped in his floating prison, could do nothing but imagine his world on land dissolving while he chased whales in oceans no map could ever make familiar. In such isolation, time began to lose its borders. Men dreamed in fragments, waking unsure if what they remembered had happened a year before or only last week. A face from port blurred with a face glimpsed on deck. Sometimes they could not recall the names of their own shipmates, though they had worked beside them every hour of every day. Madness crept in quietly, not as screaming delirium, but as the slow erosion of self. A man who once knew who he was became little more than a body moved by habit. There was a phrase whispered in the forecastle, a voyage that never ends. It was not meant as poetry, but as dread. For many sailors, the voyage did never end. Some jumped ship in foreign ports, hoping to vanish into new lives, though many only found chains or starvation ashore. Others died at sea, their bodies lowered into water that closed over them without trace. Even those who made it home often found themselves pressed again, lured or forced back aboard another vessel, until their lives became a chain of departures and none of return. The ship itself seemed to feed on this cycle. Whalers were designed not for comfort, but endurance. Everything about them was made to survive longer than the men within. Oak timbers weathered decades of storms. Iron fittings could be replaced, sails patched, rigging spliced anew. But men grew old, grew sick, grew broken. The ship carried on, outliving each crew, moving from captain to captain, crew to crew, while human lives burned out like candles along its deck. This endlessness weighed heaviest during the long calms. Weeks could pass with no wind, the ship stranded in a still ocean where water lay glass-like and merciless. No horizon shifted, no progress was made. Scurvy gnawed at gums, dysentery thinned the strongest, and the casks of water grew foul. Under such skies, time itself seemed to have died. The men lay listless, staring at sails that did not stir, at a sea that refused to move. They were already ghosts aboard a ship that refused to stop breathing. Some officers encouraged superstition as a weapon against despair. They told men that their voyage could not end until fate was appeased, that the sea demanded so many whales, so much oil, before it would grant release. Each barrel stowed became a bargaining chip in an endless negotiation with the ocean itself. But the ocean never answered, and the men kept working, kept killing, kept cutting, until it felt as though they were not hunters but prisoners tasked with an infinite labor. And then there was the betrayal of a rival. Imagine a man stepping ashore after years, his boots finally grinding against cobblestone instead of deck planks. For a moment, there was relief, but the land had changed. The town no longer looked the same. The faces of wives and children were aged beyond recognition. Younger brothers now stood taller. Daughters were married. Parents were gone. The sailor himself seemed a stranger to his own world. The voyage had stolen not just years, but belonging. This dislocation was so common that many never returned to land for long. Better to keep sailing, to remain in the rhythm of the sea than to face the estrangement of home. In this way, the voyage became life itself, without beginning or end. A boy might go to sea at 15 and never truly come back, living and dying in that cycle until the ocean finally kept him. Why would you not survive such a voyage? Because survival demands an ending, a point at which the suffering ceases, the labor completes, the mind is allowed rest. But the whaling voyage offered no such mercy. It stretched and stretched until men no longer knew what survival even meant. To endure was not to live, but simply to continue, and continuation itself became indistinguishable from death. In the creak of the hull, in the slap of waves, in the endless chase of whales across waters that had no shore, men discovered that time itself could kill more surely than harpoons or storms. The voyage never ended, because even if you returned, some part of you remained out there still, rocking with the swells, staring at the horizon, waiting for a shore that would never again feel like your own. And so the voyage swallowed lives not with violence, but with eternity. That was the final cruelty of the 19th century whaling ship. It did not simply risk ending you quickly, it risked never letting you end at all. There is a certain cruelty in how the sea claims its debts. A storm may strike, a whale may overturn a boat, a mast may crack and bury men beneath its fall. These are swift moments, violent but merciful in their finality. Yet far more common was the slower grip, the the way the ocean reached into a man's mind, his body, his very memory, until it became impossible to tell whether he had ever truly lived on land at all. For those who spent years aboard whaling ships, the ocean was not something outside the vessel, pressing against the hull. It seeped inward, flooding every crevice of thought and routine. Its salt lived in the pores of their skin. Its endlessness carved itself into their sense of time. And long after the voyage was done, if it was ever truly done, the ocean refused to release them. It lingered in the ears, in the lungs, in the marrow, like an infection that had no cure. Men who had once been farmers, carpenters, apprentices, at a forge returned from voyages speaking in half whispers, their eyes darting to horizons that no one else could see. They carried the sea in their gait, rolling as though the ground beneath them still shifted. At night they woke from dreams with the taste of brine on their tongues, convinced they were drowning. Wives who reached for them found strangers, men restless in their own homes, pacing the floorboards like decks. There was no retirement from the sea. Even those who swore never to go back often did, not because of wages alone, but because the land no longer seemed to belong to them. It was as though the ocean, having once made them part of its endless labor, would not permit them to stand still on soil again. Silence on shore was unbearable. The stillness of a summer night, the quiet of a winter morning. These were not comforts, but torments. They longed for the slap of water on hull, the cries of gulls, the crack of canvas. And if these were absent, their minds supplied them anyway. The sailors called it sea fever, though doctors on land named it something else. A kind of madness born from monotony and distance. But for those who lived it, there was no distinction between illness and identity. Once a man had sailed too long, he was marked. He would carry the ocean inside him until he died, no matter where he died. This was why so many never stayed ashore. They enlisted again and again, until their names blurred across the logbooks of a dozen ships. They chased voyages not because they desired them, but because they could not endure the absence of them. To be stranded on land was to be reminded every moment of what they had lost, or worse, what they could no longer forget. And the ocean had other ways of keeping men. Bodies consigned to it did not return. There were no graves to mark, no stones to carve with names. The ocean erased as efficiently as it consumed, scattering bones among creatures that fed in the dark. A mother might wait on a wharf until her hair turned white, but no coffin would ever come home. All she would receive, if anything, was the faint report of a man lost overboard in the heavy seas or struck down by a falling spar. That was the ocean's final cruelty, not only to take the living, but to deny the dead to those who mourned them. And even when the ocean spared a man's life, it carried pieces of him away. Fingers lost to frostbite in the Arctic, eyes blinded by oil fires on deck, lungs ruined by years of salt air and rancid smoke. The voyage ended, but the damage lingered. A constant reminder that the ocean's claim was permanent. You might step back on land, but you never stepped away clean. There are records of men who returned home only to sit by the shoreline, staring out for hours, saying nothing. Asked what they looked for, they could not answer. Perhaps they were waiting for ships that had gone down, for crewmates never seen again. Perhaps they were waiting for themselves, some version of who they had been, lost somewhere between horizons. The ocean, it seemed, had taken not just their labor, but their reflection. To survive such a voyage was not truly to survive at all. It was to accept a permanent haunting. Every gust of wind on a city street sounded like a sail catching. Every creak of a floorboard became a mast straining under pressure. The very rhythm of life was altered. Meals on shore felt indulgent and strange. Sleep in beds too soft and untrustworthy. The men were adrift even in their homes, caught between two worlds but belonging to neither. Some grew bitter. They drank themselves into silence, unable to reconcile the ocean's hold on them with the demands of families who wanted them whole. Others became preachers, insisting that the sea was a punishment from God, that the years lost upon it were a form of penance, but most simply withered. worn out before their time, old at 40, their lives measured not in decades, but in voyages survived, and haunted by the suspicion that none of them had ever truly ended. The ocean did not need to drown you to win. It could leave you alive and still claim victory, for it would live inside you, gnawing, whispering, reminding. That is why so many whalers spoke of the sea as though it were a living creature, not water, not weather, but a will that decided who would be kept and who would be returned. And in most cases, even those returned were never whole again. Why would you not survive such a voyage? Because survival implies release. It suggests that you can emerge from an ordeal and resume life as it once was. But a 19th century whaling voyage was not a wound that healed. It was a possession. The ocean marked men as its own, and long after their ships had been broken up for timber, long after the lamps had burned the last of their oil, the sea still echoed inside their skulls. In that sense, the voyage was never about whales alone. The ocean was hunting too. It did not need harpoons. It needed only time and patience, and the certainty that no matter how far you sailed, no matter if you ever set foot on land again, it would never let you go. And so, you've seen what waited for men who stepped aboard a whaling ship in the 19th century. It wasn't adventure. It wasn't freedom. It was seasickness that emptied their stomachs, storms that broke their bones, hunger that hollowed their faces, and the endless horizon that crushed their spirits. They thought they were chasing whales, but in truth, they were walking straight into the jaws of an ocean that would never let them go. Now I want to hear from you. After hearing what these men endured, months of monotony, years of danger, and the promise of riches that almost never came, do you think you could have survived a voyage like this? Or would the ocean have taken you too? Let me know down in the comments. And remember, tell me where you're watching from and what time of night it is as you listen. It's always eerie, almost comforting, to see your words scatter across the world like little lanterns burning against the dark. If this story has kept you awake tonight, drifting with the ghosts of sailors who never came home, then don't forget to subscribe and share this channel with others. Because there are still countless histories, strange, brutal, and forgotten, that wait out there like waves in the dark, and together we'll face them.